The Kologrivovs were as fond of Lara as ever, and wished her to stay on with them. But now that Lipa had grown up, she regarded herself as superfluous in the house. She refused her salary. They had to press it on her. She believed her position to be unendurably false, and imagined that they all found her a burden, and were only putting a good face on it. She longed to run away both from herself and the Kologrivovs, as fast and as far as her legs would carry her. But according to her ideas, she had first to repay the money she'd borrowed, and at the moment she had no conceivable means of doing so. She ate her heart out in helpless exasperation. Pasha, Lipa, the Kologrivovs, the money, all her worries whirled inside her mind. She was sick and disgusted with life. It was driving her insane. She wished she could break with everything she'd ever known or experienced and start on something altogether new and untried. In this mood, at Christmas in the year 1911, she arrived at a fateful decision. She would leave the Kologrivovs now, at once, and set up on her own, and she would get the money to do this from Komarovsky. It seemed to her that after all that had been between them, he must help her chivalrously, without any demands or explanations or sordid conditions. With this in mind, she set out for Petrovska Street on the night of the 27th of December. A revolver, loaded with the safety catch off, was inside her muff. Should Komarovsky refuse or humiliate her in any way, she intended to shoot him. Komarovsky's housekeeper received her with ohs and ahs, telling her that Komarovsky was out, but she must stay and wait for him. "I can't. I'm in a hurry. Where is he?" He was at a Christmas party. Clutching the scrap of paper with the address on it, she ran down the familiar gloomy staircase with its stained glass coats of arms and started off for the Sventitsky's house in Muchnoy Gorodok. That winter, Yuri was preparing an essay on the nervous system of the eye for the university gold medal competition. Though he was qualifying only in general medicine, he had almost a specialist's knowledge of the physiology of sight. His interest in it was in keeping with the other sides of his character, his creative gifts, and his concern for the relation between imagery in art and the logical structure of ideas. Just now, he and Tonya were driving in a hired sleigh to the Sventitsky's Christmas party. After 6 years of childhood and adolescence spent in the same house, they knew everything there was to know about each other and had their own ways and habits, including their way of snorting at each other's jokes and their companionable silences. Now, too, they drove almost in silence, thinking their own thoughts, their lips tightly closed against the cold. To Yuri, his old friend Tonya, until then a part of his life which had always been taken for granted, had suddenly become the most inaccessible and complicated being he could imagine. She had become a woman. Now that Tonya had taken this supreme and most difficult task on her slender, fragile shoulders, she now seemed to him slender and fragile, though she was a perfectly healthy girl. He was filled with that ardent sympathy and shy wonder, which are the beginning of passion. An immemorial ritual was followed at the Sventitsky's Christmas parties. At 10 o'clock, after the children had gone home, the tree was lit a second time for the young people and grown-ups, and the party went on till morning. Elderly people played cards all night long in the sitting-room, curtained off from the ballroom by heavy hangings on bronze rings. In the centre of the room the dancers twirled and spun dizzily. Ices and cool drinks were carried round the noisy, milling, shuffling crowd. Without stopping in the ballroom, Tonya and Yuri went through to their host's rooms at the other end of the flat. The back rooms were cluttered up with furniture which had been moved out of the ballroom and the drawing-room. Here the Sventitskys kept their Christmas workshop, their magic kitchen. There was a smell of paint and glue, and coloured wrappings and boxes of cotillion favours and spare candles were piled up on every chair. The Sventitskys were writing names on cards for presents and for seats at the supper table. They were overjoyed at Tonya's and Yuri's coming. They remembered them as children and unceremoniously set them to work. All this time Lara was in the ballroom. She was not in evening dress and did not know anyone there, but she stayed on, either waltzing or wandering aimlessly round the room. Once or twice she stopped and stood hesitating outside the sitting-room, hoping that Komarovsky, who sat facing the doorway playing cards, might see her. But he held his cards in front of him like a small shield in his left hand, and either really did not notice her, or pretended not to. It was almost 2 in the morning. Yuri's ears were ringing. There'd been an interval with tea and petit four, and now the dancing had begun again. Yuri was standing absent-mindedly in the middle of the ballroom, watching Tonya as she danced with a stranger. She swept up to him, flounced her short satin train like a fish, and vanished. She was very excited. During the interval she'd refused tea, and had slaked her thirst with innumerable tangerines, peeling them and wiping her fingers and the corners of her mouth on a handkerchief the size of a fruit blossom. Now, as she spun round with her unknown partner, brushing Yuri, who scowled and tried to get out of the way, she caught at his hand and gave him a warm smile. The handkerchief she'd been holding stayed in his fingers. He pressed it to his lips and closed his eyes. It smelt equally enchantingly of tangerines and of Tonya's hand. This was something new in Yuri's life, something he'd never felt before, something sharp and piercing that went through his whole being from top to toe. This naively childish smell was like a friendly, sensible word whispered in the dark. He pressed the handkerchief to his eyes and lips, lost in its kindly smell. At that moment, a shot rang out inside the sitting room. There was a moment's silence. Then uproar broke out. Some people rushed about, screaming. Others ran into the sitting room, from which still other people were emerging, weeping and arguing and all talking at once. "What has she done? What has she done?" Komarovsky kept saying in despair. "Boria! Boria, tell me you're alive!" Mrs. Kornakov was screaming hysterically. The Kornakovs were guests at the party and friends of the Sventitskys. Boria Kornakov was the assistant public prosecutor at the Moscow Central Court. "Where's Dr. Drokov?" cried Mrs. Kornakov. "How can you say it's nothing but a scratch? It proves how right I always was. He exposed those criminals. Now you see what kind of people they are. Oh, my poor darling, martyred for your convictions. There she is, the scum. There she is. I'll scratch your eyes out, you slut. You won't get away with it. What did you say, Mr. Komarovsky? You? She shot at you? No, I can't bear it. This is a tragic moment, Mr. Komarovsky. I haven't time to listen to jokes." The crowd rolled out of the sitting room into the ballroom. At the head of it came Kornakov, laughingly assuring everyone that he was quite all right, and dabbing with a napkin at a scratch on his left hand. They were followed by another group who were leading Lara by the arms. Yuri was dumbfounded. This girl again. And again in such extraordinary circumstances. And again that grey-haired man was near her. This time Yuri knew him. It was the prominent lawyer, Komarovsky, who'd had something to do with his father's estate. So it was this girl who fired the shot at the prosecutor. Must be for political reasons. Poor thing, she was in for a bad time. How proudly beautiful she was. 3 weeks after the incident at the Sventitskys' Christmas party, Tonya's mother, Anna, died of an attack of asthma resulting from acute oedema of the lungs. The day of the funeral was still and heavy, a day of ended frost and of departed life, a day meant for a funeral. It was in the same churchyard that Yuri's mother lay buried. He had not been to her grave in recent years. He glanced in its direction and whispered, "Mamma," almost as he might have done years before. They walked back in solemn, picturesque groups. The meanderings of the swept paths seemed out of keeping with the sorrowful deliberation of the mourner's steps. Tonya walked on her father's arm, followed by the Krugers. She looked well in black. Hoarfrost, bearded like mould, sprouted on the chains which held the crosses to the domes, and on the pink walls of the monastery. Yuri walked on alone, ahead of the others. When his mother had died 10 years earlier, he'd been a child. He could still remember his tears of inconsolable grief and terror. In those days, his self was not important to him. He could hardly even realize that such a being as Yuri existed on its own or had any value or interest. What mattered then was everything outside and around him. From every side the external world pressed in on him, dense, undeniable, tangible as a forest, and the reason why he was so shaken by his mother's death was that at her side he had lost himself in the forest, and now suddenly found her gone, and himself alone in it. The forest was made up of everything in the world. Everything he knew was in it. Clouds and shop fronts and arcades and the inaccessibly high starry heaven at night, and the good God and the saints. Now it was quite different. In his 12 years at school and college, Yuri had studied ancient history and scripture, legends and poets, history and natural science, reading all these things as if they were the chronicles of his house, his family tree. Now he was afraid of nothing, neither of life nor of death. He felt that he was on equal footing with the universe. And the prayers for Anna now had a different sound for him from the prayers he'd heard for his mother as a child. Then he prayed in confusion, fear, and pain. Now he listened to the service as if it were a personal message to him, affecting him directly. He attended to the words, and expected of them a clear meaning, as of any other serious communication. With joyful anticipation, he thought of the day or two which he would set aside and spend alone, away from the university and from his home, in order to write a poem in memory of Anna. He would include in it all those random things which life would send his way, a few of Anna's best characteristics, Tonya in mourning, and what he'd seen in the street on the way back from the funeral. After the incident at the Sventitskys' Christmas party, Lara was ill for several days, feverish and in a half-conscious condition. Komarovsky's mind was crowded with stormy feelings. His position was threatened. His reputation had been endangered by the incident. At whatever cost, he must prevent the gossip, stop the rumours, strangle them at birth. Another reason for his agitation was that he had once again experienced the irresistible attraction of this wild, desperate girl. He'd always known that she was different from everyone else. There'd always been something unique about her, but how deeply, painfully, irreparably had he wounded her and upset her life, and how restless and violent she was in her determination to reshape her destiny and start afresh. It was clear from every point of view that he must help her, take a room for her perhaps, but in no circumstances must he come near her. On the contrary, he must keep away, stand aside so as not to overshadow her, or else with her violent nature there was no knowing what she might do. And what a lot of trouble was still to come. This wasn't the sort of thing for which they patted you on the head. The law was wide awake, and the further it went, the more complications there would be. They'd have to have proof that Lara had meant to shoot at him and not at Kornakov. But even that wouldn't be an end of it. She would only be cleared of one part of the charge, but still would be liable to prosecution for the rest. Naturally, he would do everything to prevent it. If the case came into court, he would get expert evidence from a psychiatrist that she had not been responsible for her actions at the moment when she fired the shot, and would see to it that the proceedings were dropped. When she recovered, Lara moved to lodgings near the Smolensky market. The flat was at the top of a 2-story house of antique design, and there were draymen living in the other part of it, and a warehouse on the ground floor. Pasha was giving a lot of trouble. So long as Lara was seriously ill, he was not allowed to see her, and what was he to feel? Lara had meant to kill a man to whom, so far as Pasha knew, she felt indifferent, and was then shielded by this very man, the object of her attempt at murder. If it had not been for this man, Lara would have been arrested and tried. Thanks to him, she was able to continue her studies safe and unharmed. Pasha was puzzled and tormented. When she was better, Lara sent for him and said, "I'm a bad woman. You don't know me. You have no idea of what I'm like. Someday I'll tell you. I can't talk about it now. You can see for yourself. Every time I try, I start crying. But you must let me be. You must forget all about me. I'm not worthy of you." Pasha suspected her of all the 7 deadly sins, disbelieved every word she said, and was ready to curse and hate her. but he loved her to distraction, and was jealous of her very thoughts, and of the mug she drank from, and of the pillow on which she lay. If they were not to go out of their minds, they must act quickly and firmly. They made up their minds to get married at once, without waiting for their examinations. They were married on Whit Monday. Straight from the church, they drove to the wedding breakfast at the studio into which Pasha had moved that day. When all the guests had gone and they were left alone, Pasha felt uneasy at the sudden silence. A street lamp shone from across the road, and however tightly he drew the curtains, a streak of light as thin as a shaving came into the room. This light gave him no rest. He felt as if they were being watched. He discovered to his horror that he was thinking more of the light than of Lara, or of himself, or of his love for her. During this night, which lasted an eternity, Pasha Antipov reached the heights of joy and the lowest depths of despair. His suspicions and guesses alternated with Lara's confessions. He questioned her, and with each of her answers his spirit sank lower, as though he were hurtling down a precipice. His wounded imagination could not keep up with her revelations. They talked till morning. In all Pasha's life there had been no change in him so decisive and abrupt as in the course of this night. He got up a different man, almost astonished that he was still called Pasha Antipov. 2 weeks later, their friends arranged a farewell party for them. Both Pasha and Lara had passed their exams, both had done equally brilliantly, and both had been offered jobs in the same town in the Urals. They were setting out for it the next day. For the third day running, the Moscow weather was wretched. It was the second autumn of the German war. The successes of the first year had been followed by setbacks. Brusilov's Eighth Army, which had been concentrated in the Carpathians, ready to pour down the slopes into Hungary, was drawing back instead, caught by the ebb of the general retreat. Russian troops were pulling out of Galicia, which had been occupied in the first months of the fighting. Dr. Yuri Zhivago stood in the corridor of the gynecological section of the hospital outside the door of the maternity ward, to which he had brought his wife, Tonya, 3 days before. It was not yet very dark. He could see the back of the hospital, the glassed-in verandas of the private houses in the square, and the branch tram line leading to one of the hospital blocks. The rain poured with a dreary steadiness, neither hurrying nor slowing down for all the fury of the wind, which seemed enraged by the indifference of the water, and shook the creeper on one of the houses, as if meaning to tear it up by the roots. The door of the ward suddenly opened, and a ward maid came out. Yuri heard the squealing of a newborn child through the open door. "It's a son, a little boy," the woman said. "Congratulations on a safe delivery. You have to make a big fuss of her. She's had a bad time, it being the first. There's always trouble with the first." Inside the ward, 2 women in white overalls stood with their backs to the door. They were the midwife and the nurse. Squirming in the nurse's hands lay a tender, squealing human offspring, stretching and contracting like a dark red piece of India rubber. The midwife was putting a ligature on the navel before cutting the cord. Tonya lay on a high surgical bed in the middle of the room, exhausted in the cloud of her spent pain. To Yuri, she seemed like a ship lying at rest in the middle of a harbour after putting in and being unloaded. A ship which plied between an unknown country and the continent of life, across the waters of death with a cargo of new immigrant souls. One such soul had just been landed, and the ship now lay at anchor, resting in the lightness of her empty flanks. At that moment the head doctor came in. "What the devil's happening to this place?" he said. "What a filthy mess it is. Congratulations, Zhivago. Oh, and by the way, they've checked up on your class again. I can't stop them this time. There's a frightful shortage of medical personnel at the front. You'll be sniffing gunpowder before long." The Antipovs had received a welcome beyond their expectations in Yuriatin. The Guichards were remembered with affection, and this had helped Lara over the difficulties of settling down in a new place. They had now been here 4 years. Lara had had her hands full and plenty to think about. She had the house to see to, as well as Katya, her daughter, who was now 3 years old. Mafutka, their red-haired maid, did her best, but could not get all the work done. In addition, Lara shared all Pasha's interests and taught at the girls' high school. She worked ceaselessly and was happy. This was exactly the kind of life she'd dreamed of. She liked Yuriatin. She'd been born there. It stood on one of the Urals railways, and on the big river Rinva, navigable except in its upper reaches. She liked Yuriatin's provincial ways, the long vowels of its northern accent and its naively trustful intellectuals in felt boots and grey flannel sleeveless coats. She was attracted to the soil and to simple people. Paradoxically, it was Pasha, the son of a Moscow railway worker, who turned out to be an incorrigible metropolitan. He judged the people of Yuriatin much more harshly than Lara. Their ignorance and uncouthness got on his nerves. He had an unusual gift, it now appeared, for reading quickly and remembering the information he picked up. He'd read a great deal in the past, partly thanks to Lara. In the retirement of his provincial exile, he became so well-read that even Lara no longer seemed to him well-informed. As for his fellow schoolmasters, he towered above them and complained that he felt stifled. Now, in wartime, their standard, commonplace patriotism was out of tune with his own, more complicated feeling for his country. Pasha had graduated in classics and now taught Latin and ancient history, but from his earlier high school days he had kept a half-forgotten passion for the exact sciences, physics and mathematics, and it had now revived in him. Teaching himself at home, he had reached university standard in these subjects, and dreamt of taking his degree, transferring to some scientific branch, and moving with his family to Petersburg. Studying late into the night had affected his health and given him insomnia. His relations with his wife were good, but her kindness and her fussing over him oppressed him. He would not criticize her, for fear that she might take some quite innocent word of his for a reproach, a hint, perhaps, that her blood was bluer than his, or that she had once belonged to someone else. The thoughts to which he'd become accustomed in the past few years closed in on him disturbingly. It seemed to him that sooner or later they would have to be thought out to the end, and that it might as well be now. This can't go on, he thought. He should have realized it long before they were married. Why had she allowed him as a child to take his fill of gazing at her? Even then she could make him do whatever she liked. Why hadn't he had the sense to break it off when she herself had insisted on it? Wasn't it clear that it was not him she loved, but only the task she'd set herself, and was carrying out so generously? What she loved was the image of her own heroism. But what had her mission, however meritorious or noble, to do with real family life? The worst of it was that he loved her as much as ever, and yet, was he sure that it was love, even on his side? Or was it a bewildered gratitude for her loveliness and her generosity? So what was he to do? Set his wife and daughter free from this counterfeit life? This was even more important than to liberate himself. But how? When Lara heard of Pasha's decision, she was stunned, and at first could not believe her ears. But it appeared that he'd been getting ready for the past fortnight. He'd sent in his papers to the recruiting office, the high school had found a replacement, and he'd received orders to go to the military training school at Omsk. Lara howled like a peasant woman, grabbed Pasha's hands, and rolled at his feet. "Pasha, Pasha, darling," she screamed. "Don't leave us! Don't do it! Don't! Aren't you ashamed to offer up your family to some crazy notion? You, a volunteer? All your life you've laughed at Rodya, and now you're jealous. You have to swagger about in an officer's uniform, too. You have to do your own bit of saber-rattling. Pasha, what's the matter with you? You're not yourself. I don't recognize you. What's changed you like this?" After he had left, It seemed to her that the whole town was silent, and even that there were fewer crows flying about in the sky. She had had the greatest defeat of her life. Her best and brightest hopes were in ruins. In the months that followed, Pasha's letters from Siberia told her all about his moods. He was beginning to see things more clearly. He badly missed his wife and daughter, but within a few months he received an emergency commission as an ensign, and with equal suddenness was sent on active service. Suddenly his letters stopped coming. At first Lara was not worried. She put down his silence to the military operations. He couldn't write when his regiment was on the move. But in the autumn, when the advance slowed down and the troops were digging themselves in, there was still no word from him. She began to be anxious and to make inquiries, at first locally in Yuryatin, and then by post in Moscow, and then at his old field address. There was no reply. Nobody seemed to know anything. Convinced now of the futility of trying to get news of Pasha in any other way, Lara decided to go and look for him where he'd been heard of last. Together with other local ladies, she'd been giving a hand at the military ward attached to the town hospital. Now she trained seriously and qualified as a nurse, got permission to be absent from her school for 6 months, and leaving Katya in Mafutka's care, she got a job as a nurse on a hospital train going through the town of Riski to Metzola-Borch on the Hungarian border. Pasha had written his last letter to her from there. The front line had begun to move. To the south of the district where Antipov was stationed, Russian forces had succeeded in breaking through the enemy positions. Supporting units followed, widening the gap, but they fell behind, and the advance units were cut off and captured. Among the prisoners was Ensign Antipov, who was obliged to give himself up when his platoon surrendered. He was wrongly believed to have been killed by a shell and buried in the explosion. This was told on the authority of his friend Ensign Galyulin, who'd been watching through field glasses from an observation post when Antipov led the attack. Galyulin had shared Antipov's dugout. Once it was accepted that Antipov was dead, his friend was asked to take charge of his belongings and keep them for his widow. Galyulin knew Antipov from their childhood days in Moscow, when Pasha Antipov had lived with the Tvertsins and Galyulin's family had lived in the same building. There, too, he had once or twice met Lara. He'd heard nothing of either of them since. When Antipov came from Yuryatin and joined the regiment, Galyulin was struck by the change in his old friend, whom he had known as a shy, mischievous child, and who had now turned into an arrogant and erudite hypochondriac. He was intelligent, very brave, taciturn, and sarcastic. Sometimes, when Galyulin caught the melancholy expression of Pasha's eyes, he could have sworn that he saw in them, almost as though he were looking through a window, something else, perhaps an idea which possessed him, perhaps a longing for his daughter or his wife. The divisional hospital, to which Dr. Zhivago was attached, had several outlying medical units in villages just behind the front lines. It was in one of these villages that Yuri was stationed, in an area where the Germans were on the advance and on the point of encircling Russian forces. All the medical units in this area were under orders to withdraw on the following day, but during the night before the evacuation, Yuri was woken up by shouts, gunfire, and running footsteps. There was an angry glow over the village, and shadows flitted past the window. Yuri sent the orderly to ask what the commotion was about. He was told that the Germans had broken through. Yuri hurried to the hospital and found that it was true. The village was under fire. The hospital was being moved at once without waiting for the evacuation order. He ran back down the village street to collect his things, bending double and hugging the walls. Bullets whizzed past him, and from the crossroads he could see shell bursts like fiery umbrellas opening over the fields. A few yards from his billet he was knocked off his feet by the blast of an explosion and hit by a shell splinter. He fell in the middle of the road, bleeding and unconscious. The rear hospital was hidden away in a small town in the western zone, near the railway line and close to the GHQ. It was a warm day at the end of February. In the officer's ward where Yuri was convalescing, the window beside his bed was open at his request. The patients were killing time before dinner. They'd been told that a new nurse had joined the hospital staff and would be doing her first round that day. In the bed opposite Yuri's, Galyulin was looking at the newspapers which had just arrived and exclaiming indignantly at the blanks left by the censorship. Yuri was reading Tonia's letters, which the field post had delivered in a batch. The wind rustled the letters and the papers. At the sound of a light footstep, he looked up. Lara came into the ward. Both Yuri and Galyulin recognized her at once, though she did not recognize either of them. Going up to Galyulin, she asked him how he felt and took his wrist to feel his pulse, but immediately let go of it and sat down by his bed, looking at him with a puzzled expression. "This is indeed unexpected, Larissa Fyodorovna," Galyulin said. "I knew your husband. We were in the same regiment. I've kept his things for you." "It isn't possible," she kept saying. "It isn't possible. You knew him. What an extraordinary coincidence. Please tell me quickly how it happened. He was killed by a shell, wasn't he, and buried by the explosion? You see, I know. Please don't be afraid of telling me everything." Galyulin's courage failed him. He decided to tell her a comforting lie. Antipov was taken prisoner. He advanced too far with his unit. They were surrounded and cut off. He was forced to give himself up. She did not believe him. Shaken by the unexpectedness of the meeting and not wishing to break down in front of strangers, she hurried out into the corridor. A few moments later, she came back, outwardly collected. Afraid of crying again if she spoke to Galyulin, she deliberately avoided looking at him and went over to Yuri. "How do you do? How do you feel?" she asked in an expressionless voice. Yuri had seen her agitation and tears. He wanted to ask her why she was so upset, and to tell her that he had seen her twice before in his life, once as a schoolboy and once as a student, but he was afraid of intruding on her and of her misunderstanding him. He said instead, "Thank you, I'm a doctor, I'm looking after myself, I don't need anything." For several days the weather was troubled, uncertain, with a warm, talkative wind in the night smelling of damp earth. During these days there were strange reports from GHQ and alarming rumours from the interior. Telegraphic communications with Petersburg were cut off time and again. Moscow, too, was going through disturbed, exciting times, and was on the eve of something important. There was growing discontent among the masses. Grave political events were imminent. Everywhere, at every corner, people were talking politics. Lara had noticed a sharp change round her recently. Before, there had been obligations of all kinds, sacred duties, your duty to your country, to the army, to society. But now that the war seemed lost, everything seemed to have been deposed. Nothing was any longer sacred. In her own case, Lara felt that now it was quite clear what had happened to poor Pasha. She must soon finish her job there and go back home to Yuryatin and Katya. Meanwhile, she did her rounds morning and evening, exchanging a few words with each patient. What a curious creature, she thought of Yuri, young and gruff. You couldn't call him handsome, with his turned-up nose, but he is intelligent in the best sense of the word, alive, and with an attractive mind. It occurred to her that after all the devotion Galyulin had shown to Pasha's memory, the trouble he'd taken to look after his things, she had not so much as asked him who he was and where he came from. She was disgusted with herself. To make up for her omission and not to seem ungrateful, she asked him all about himself when she made her round next morning. "Merciful goodness," she exclaimed at what he told her. 28 Brest Street, the Tivertsins, the revolution of 1905, that winter. No, she couldn't remember having met him. He must forgive her. But that year, that house, how vividly it all came back to her. All day long she went about thinking about that house, and almost talking to herself and exclaiming out loud, to think of it, Brest Street number 28. And now they were shooting again. But how much more frightening it was now. You couldn't say it's the children shooting this time. The children had all grown up. The boys were all here in the army. All those simple people who'd lived in that house and in others like it, they were all here. How extraordinary it was, how very extraordinary. That year there was street fighting in Petersburg, and the Petersburg garrison joined the insurgents. The revolution had come. The small town to which the hospital had been evacuated was called Zhivago. Black dust hung over it all day long, like a cloud of locusts. It was raised by the troops and convoys passing through the town. They moved in both directions, some going to the front and others coming away from it, and it was impossible to tell if the war was still going on or had already ceased. Every day Zhivago, Lara and Galyulin found new duties growing up like mushrooms. Zhivago and Galyulin were now both fully recovered and had been enlisted onto the hospital staff. They and a few other knowledgeable and experienced people from the cities were picked for every job that came along. They served on the municipal council and as minor commissars in the army and the health department, and they looked upon this succession of tasks as a diversion. But more and more often they felt that it was time to stop playing and get back to their ordinary occupations and their homes. Yuri and Lara were often brought together by their work. After 2 months in Zhivago, Yuri wrote to his wife, "My dear Tonya, I've been to see some of the army units in the neighborhood. The chaos keeps on getting worse in spite of everything they do to improve discipline and morale. By way of a postscript, I must tell you that I do a lot of my work with a certain Antipova, a nurse from Moscow who was born in the Urals. You remember the girl student who shot at the public prosecutor at that terrible Christmas party? I think there was a trial afterwards. I remember telling you that Misha and I had once seen her when she was still a schoolgirl at some sordid hotel where your father took us. I can't remember why we went, only that it was a bitterly cold night. I think that it was at the time of the Presnia Rising. Well, that girl was Antipova. I've made several attempts to come home, but it's not so simple. It's not so much the work. We could hand that over easily enough. The trouble is the actual journey. Either there are no trains at all, or else they're so full that there's no hope of getting in. But of course it can't go on like this indefinitely, and some of us who've resigned or been discharged, including Antipova and Galyulin and myself, have made up our minds that whatever happens, we shall leave as soon as possible." The letter finished with these words, "If it were not for you, if it were not for my constant, faithful thoughts of you and of our home, I would never have survived these 2 terrible, devastating years of war. But soon we'll be together. Our life will begin again. Then everything will be cleared up." One evening, a few days later, Yuri found Lara in the pantry. A pile of linen straight out of the wringer lay in front of her. She was ironing. The windows were open. In the room the scent of lime blossom mixed as in an old park with the caraway-bitter smell of dry twigs. To them were added the charcoal fumes of the 2 flat irons, which Lara used alternately, putting them each in turn in the flue to keep them hot. "You look as if you've done the laundry for the whole hospital." "No, there's lots of mine there." "You keep on teasing me about getting stuck here in Zhivago. Well, this time I mean it. I'm going. You see, I'm getting ready, packing up. When I've finished, I'll be off. But I can't just snap my fingers and say goodbye. I have to hand over properly, and the inventory must be checked. I don't want it to look as if I've stolen something and run away. And who's to take over? That's the problem. Do stop worrying about carpets and china. To hell with them. What a thing to fuss about at a time like this. Just think what's going on nowadays. And you and I are living in these days. Do you realize what an unheard-of thing is happening? Such a thing only happens once in an eternity. The whole of Russia has had its roof torn off, and you and I and everyone else are out in the open. And there's nobody to spy on us. We're free. Not just free in theory, in words. It's real freedom, dropped out of the sky. Freedom beyond our expectations. Last night, I was watching a meeting in the square. It was an astonishing sight. Mother Russia is on the move. She can't stand still. She's restless. She can't stop. And it isn't as if only people were talking. Stars and trees meet and converse. Flowers talk philosophy at night. Stone houses hold meetings. "I know what you mean," said Lara quietly, "about stars and trees holding meetings. I understand that." It was partly the war, Yuri continued. The revolution did the rest. The war made an artificial break in life. The revolution broke out like a breath that's been held too long. Everyone was revived, reborn, changed, transformed. You might say that everyone's been through two revolutions, his own personal revolution as well as the general one. It seems to me that socialism is the sea, and that all these separate streams, these private individual revolutions, are flowing into it, flowing into the sea of life. I said life, but I mean life as you see it in a work of art, transformed by genius, creatively enriched. Only now people have decided to experience it not in books and pictures, but in themselves, not in theory, but in practice. The sudden trembling of his voice revealed his rising agitation. Lara stopped ironing and gave him a grave, astonished look. It confused him, and he forgot what he was saying. After a moment of embarrassed silence, he rushed on. "I have such a longing nowadays for an honest, productive life. I so much want to be a part of all this quickening. And then, in the middle of all this general rejoicing, I come up against your puzzlingly sad, absent look, wandering in who knows what enchanted kingdom. I'd give anything for it not to be like that, for your face to tell me that you don't need anything from anyone. For someone really close to you, your friend or your husband, to come and take me by the hand and tell me kindly to stop worrying about your fate, leave you alone. Only then, of course, I want to knock him down. I'm sorry, I didn't mean that." His voice betrayed him again. He shook his head and, with a feeling of hopeless embarrassment, got up and went to the window. Leaning on the window-sill, he looked out with absent, restless, unseeing eyes into the garden veiled in darkness, and tried to collect himself. Lara walked round her ironing-board and stopped a few paces behind him in the middle of the room. "It's what I've always been afraid of," she said, softly as if to herself. "Don't, Yuri Andreevich. You mustn't." "Oh, now just look what you've made me do." She ran back to the board where a scorched blouse sent off a thin stream of acrid smoke from under the iron. "Yuri Andreevich," she went on, thumping down the iron crossly on its stand, "do be sensible. Go off and have a drink of water and come back, my dear, and be as I've always known you till now and as I want you to be. Do you hear, Yuri Andreevich? I know you can do it. Please do it. I beg you." They had no more conversations of this kind, because the following day Lara left for Moscow on her way to the Urals. On they went, singing Eternal Memory, and whenever they stopped, the sound of their feet, the horses, and the gusts of wind seemed to carry on their singing. Passers-by made way for the procession, counted the wreaths, and crossed themselves. Some joined in out of curiosity and asked, "Who is being buried?" "Zhivago," they were told. "Oh, I see, that explains it. It isn't him, it's his wife." Well, it comes to the same thing. May she rest in peace. The last moments flashed past, counted, irrevocable. The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, the earth and all that dwells therein. The priest scattered earth in the form of a cross over the body. The coffin was closed, nailed, and lowered into the ground. Clods of earth drummed on the lid like rain as the grave was filled hurriedly by 4 spades. A mound grew up on it, and a 10-year-old boy climbed on top. Only the numb and unfeeling condition which comes over people at the end of a big funeral could account for some of the mourners thinking that he wished to make an address over his mother's grave. He raised his head, and from his vantage point absently surveyed the bare autumn landscape and the domes of the monastery. His snub-nosed face was contorted. He stretched out his neck. If a wolf cub had done this, it would have been obvious that it was about to howl. The boy covered his face with his hands. and burst into sobs. The wind bearing down on him lashed his hands and face with cold gusts of rain. A man in a black coat with tightly fitted sleeves stepped forward. It was Nikolai Nikolaevich Verdenyapin, the dead woman's brother and the uncle of the weeping boy. He went up to the boy and led him out of the graveyard. While his mother was alive, Yuri Zhivago did not know that his father had deserted them long ago and spent his time wenching and carousing in Siberia and abroad, nor that he had blown the family millions to the four winds. Later, his mother, who had always been ailing, was found to have consumption. She took to going for treatment to France and northern Italy, and Yuri accompanied her. Against this untidy background, Yuri spent his childhood, surrounded by continual mysteries and often left with strangers, always different ones. Accustomed to all these changes and to permanent unsettlement, he was not surprised at his father's absence. He could remember a time in his early childhood when an infinite variety of objects was still known by the name he bore. There were Zhivago factories, a Zhivago bank, Zhivago buildings, even a Zhivago tie-pin. But suddenly it had all vanished. They became poor. One day, in the summer of 1903, 2 years after the death of Yuri's mother, the 5 o'clock express from Sichuan to Moscow stopped suddenly and unexpectedly far out on the marshy plains near the great Duplyanka estates. White puffs of steam flurried over the engine, and an alarmed hooting drifted across the fields. In a second-class compartment of the train sat Misha Gordon, who was travelling with his father, a lawyer from Orenburg. Misha was a boy of 11, with a thoughtful face and big, dark eyes. He was in his second form at school. His father, Grigory Osipovich Gordon, was being transferred to a new post in Moscow. His mother and sisters were already there, arranging the flat. Misha and his father had been travelling for 3 days. Russia, with its fields, steppes, villages and towns, bleached lime-white by the sun, flew past them, wrapped in hot clouds of dust. For as long as he could remember, Misha had never ceased to wonder how it was that a human being with arms and legs like everyone else, and with a language and a way of life common to all the rest, could be so different. A being liked by so few and loved by no one. He could not understand how it was that if you were worse than other people, you could not improve yourself by trying. What did it mean to be a Jew? What was the purpose of it? What was the reward or the justification of this unarmed challenge which brought nothing but grief? When he took his problem to his father, he was told that he must not argue like that, but he was offered no solution deep enough to attract him, or to make him bow silently to the inevitable. And making an exception only for his parents, he gradually became contemptuous of all the grown-ups who had made this mess and were quite unable to clear it up. He was quite sure that when he was big, he would straighten it all out. For instance, no one could suggest that his father should not have run after that lunatic when he rushed out into the corridor, or that he should not have stopped the train when the man pushed him aside, flung open the door, and threw himself headfirst out of the express, like a diver leaping from a springboard into a swimming pool. Yet now that the train had been stuck for ages, the fact that it was not just anyone, but precisely Grigory Osipovich who had pulled the communication cord, made it seem that the hold-up on the whole annoying business had been caused by the Gordon family. No one knew for certain why there was such a long delay. Some said that the sudden stoppage had damaged the pneumatic brakes, others that the train had stopped on a gradient and the engine couldn't take it without getting up speed. A third view was that as the suicide was a well-known person, his lawyer, who'd been with him on the train, had insisted on officials being called from the nearest station so that a sworn statement could be drawn up. This was why the driver's mate had climbed up the telegraph pole. The inspection trolley bringing the officials should now be on its way. The body of the suicide lay on the grass by the side of the bank. Knots of constantly changing onlookers and sympathizers surrounded him, while his friends and travelling companion, a thick-set, haughty lawyer who looked like a well-bred animal in a sweaty shirt, stood over him sullenly with an expressionless face. In answer to all questions, he shrugged his shoulders and said crossly, "He was an alcoholic. What do you expect?" Misha had been deeply shaken by the event, and had at first cried with shock and pity. In the course of the long journey, the man who was now dead had come several times to their compartment and had talked for hours with Misha's father. He had said that he found relief in the moral decency, peace, and understanding which he discovered in him, and had asked him endless questions about fine points of law concerning deeds of settlement, bankruptcy, and fraud. "Well, I never," he exclaimed at Gordon's answers. "Is the law as merciful as that? My lawyer takes a much more gloomy view." Each time that this nervous wreck of a man calmed down, his travelling companion had come from their first-class coach to fetch him and drag him off to the restaurant car to drink champagne. This companion was the same smartly dressed lawyer who now stood over his body, looking as if nothing could surprise him. It was hard to escape the feeling that his client's ceaseless agitation had somehow been to his advantage. Misha's father had told him that the suicide had been a well-known millionaire, Zhivago, a good-natured profligate, by then half out of his mind. Unrestrained by Misha's presence, the man had talked about his late wife and his son, a boy about Misha's age. To Misha he had shown an unaccountable affection. He'd showered him with presents, jumping out to buy them at the big stations where the bookstalls of the first-class waiting rooms also sold toys and local curios. He had drunk incessantly and complained that he'd not slept for 3 months, and that as soon as he sobered up, for however short a while, he suffered torments unimaginable to any normal human being. At the end he'd rushed into their compartment, seized Gordon by the hand, tried to tell him something, but found he could not, and had dashed out into the corridor and thrown himself from the train. Now Misha sat examining the small wooden box of Ural's minerals, which had been the last gift of the dead man. Suddenly there was a general stir. A trolley rolled up on the parallel track. A doctor, 2 policemen, and a magistrate with a cockade in his hat jumped out. Questions were asked in cold, business-like voices, and notes taken. The policemen and the guards, slipping and sliding awkwardly in the sand, dragged the corpse up the embankment. A peasant woman started wailing. The passengers were asked to go back to their seats. The guard blew his whistle, and the train moved on. At the beginning of 1905, Amalia Karlovna Guichard, the widow of a Belgian engineer and herself a Russianized Frenchwoman, arrived in Moscow from the Urals with her 2 children, her son Rodya and her daughter Larissa. She placed her son in a military academy and her daughter in a girls' high school. Madame Guichard's husband had left her his savings, stocks which had been rising and were now beginning to fall. To stop the drain on her resources and to have something to do, she bought a small business. This was Levitskaya's dressmaking establishment near the Triumphal Arch in Moscow. She took it over from Levitskaya's heirs, together with the firm's goodwill, its clientele, and all its seamstresses and apprentices. This she did on the advice of Komarovsky, a lawyer who'd been a friend of her husband's and was now her mainstay, a cold-blooded businessman who knew the Russian business world like the back of his hand. It was with Komarovsky that she had arranged her move by correspondence, and it was he who had persuaded her to send Rodya to the military academy and Lara to the school of his choice, and who joked in an offhand way with the boy and stared at the girl so that he made her blush. They stayed about a month at an hotel before moving into the small 3-roomed flat adjoining the workshop. Madame Guichard was a plump blonde of about 35, whose heart attacks alternated with her fits of silliness. She was a dreadful coward and terrified of men. It was because of this that out of sheer panic and confusion she drifted from the embraces of one lover to those of another. The presence of the children sometimes embarrassed Madame Guichard during Komarovsky's visits. He often came to see them, and as he walked through the workshop on his way to their flat, the seamstresses muttered with ironical disapproval, "Here comes his lordship," Amalia's heartache, old goat, lady killer. Lara was only a little over 16, but her figure was completely formed. People thought she was 18 or more. She worked well at school, not because she had an abstract love of learning, but because only the best pupils were exempted from paying fees. With the same ease as she worked at her lessons, she washed her mother's dishes and ran her errands. She moved with a silent grace, and everything about her, voice, figure, gestures, her grey eyes and her fair hair, was fitting and harmonious. It was a Sunday in the middle of July, and on holidays you could stay in bed a little longer. Lara lay on her back, her hands clasped behind her head. The workshop was quiet. The window looking out on the street was open. Lara heard the rattle of a droshky in the distance turn into a smooth glide as the wheels left the cobbles for the groove of a tram track, and conjured up in her imagination the sunny side of Coachmakers' Row as it must be at this hour, with the enormous carriages displayed on the cleanly swept floors of the coachmakers' sheds. And a little further down the street, the dragoons exercising in the yard of the Znamensky barracks, and a little further still, Petrovska Street, where Komarovsky had an apartment. His voice drifted, unbidden, into her thoughts. "Good heavens, Lara, what an idea! I just wanted to show you my flat, as we're so near." It had been the name day of Olya, the small daughter of some friends of Komarovsky's who lived in Coachmakers' Row, and the grown-ups were having a party, with dancing and champagne for the occasion. He had invited Mamma, but Mamma couldn't go. She wasn't feeling well. Mamma had said, "Take Lara. You're always telling me to look after Lara. Well, now you look after her." And look after her he had. It was all this waltzing that had started it. What a crazy business it was. You spun round and round, thinking of nothing. While the music played, a whole eternity went by, like life in a novel. She could never have imagined that he danced so well. What clever hands he had. What assurance as he gripped you by the waist. But never again would she allow anyone to kiss her like that. She could never have dreamt there could be so much effrontery in anyone's lips when they were pressed for such a long time against your own. She must stop all this nonsense. Stop playing at being shy, simpering and lowering her eyes, or it would end in disaster. This was where a terrible borderline lay. One step and you would be hurled into an abyss. She must stop thinking about dancing. That was the root of the evil. She must boldly refuse, pretend that she'd never learned to dance, or that she'd broken her leg. Yuri Zhivago was also living in Moscow at this time. When his uncle Nikolai Nikolaevich Vedenyapin had moved from his fastness on the Volga to Petersburg, he had sent Yuri to Moscow to stay with his relations, the Gromykos. The atmosphere at the Gromykos was eminently suitable, Nikolai Nikolaevich thought. Their daughter, Tonya, was Yuri's age, and Misha Gordon, Yuri's friend and classmate, spent some of his time with them. And a comical triumvirate they make, thought Nikolai Nikolaevich. The three of them had a mania for preaching chastity. It was right, of course, for adolescents to go through a frenzy of purity, but they were overdoing it. They'd lost all sense of proportion. How childish and eccentric they were. Obsessed by sex, they labelled everything to do with it as vulgar, and used the word ad nauseam, blushing or growing pale as they uttered it. Vulgar was applied to instinct, pornography, to prostitution, and almost to the whole physical world. Gromyko had a house at the corner of Sivtsev-Vrashek. Alexander Alexandrovich Gromyko was a professor of chemistry at the Petrov Academy. He had a wife, Anna Nekruga. Her father was an ironmaster. He owned an enormous estate in the Urals near Yuryatin. On it were several abandoned and unprofitable mines. The Gromykos were cultivated, hospitable, and great connoisseurs and lovers of music. They often held receptions and evenings of chamber music at which string quartets and piano trios were performed. Yuri settled down very comfortably and happily in his new home. The weather that winter was unseasonable. Tap, tap, tap went the water drops on the metal of the drain pipes and the cornices, roof tapping messages to roof as if it were spring. It was thawing. Lara walked all the way home from Komarovsky's flat in a daze, and only realized what had happened to her when she reached the house. Everyone was asleep. She sat down at her mother's dressing table, still in her pale mauve, almost white, lace-trimmed frock and long veil, borrowed for the evening from the workshop, as if it were a fancy dress. Her hands clasped upon the table, she sat facing a reflection in the looking-glass, but seeing nothing. After a while, she dropped her head on her hands. If Mamma got to hear about it, she would kill her. She would kill her, and then she would kill herself. How had it happened? How could it possibly have happened? It was too late now. She should have thought of it earlier. Now she was, what was it called? A fallen woman. She was a woman out of a French novel. Though tomorrow she would go to school and sit side by side with those other girls who were like babies compared with her. Oh, God, how could it have happened? Outside the window, the water drops lisped. The thaw muttered its spells. Down the road, someone was banging on the neighbour's door. Lara sat with bowed head and quivering shoulders, weeping. If Komarovsky's intrusion into Lara's life had only filled her with disgust, she could have rebelled and broken with him in the months that followed. But it was not so simple. It flattered her that a handsome man, whose hair was turning grey, old enough to be her father, a man who was applauded at meetings and mentioned in the newspapers, should spend his time and money on her, take her out to concerts and theatres, tell her that she looked divine, and should generally, as they say, improve her mind. After all, she was still a schoolgirl in a brown uniform who enjoyed harmless conspiracies at school. But these childishly adventurous moods were short-lived. A nagging, broken-spirited horror at herself was taking root in her. Worn out by struggling with her lessons and by sleepless nights, tears, and an everlasting headache, she was sleepy all day long. The war with Japan had not yet finished, but it was unexpectedly overshadowed by other events. Waves of revolution swept across Russia, each greater and more extraordinary than the last. The last months of 1905 were a time of strikes and unrest amongst workers and students in Moscow and elsewhere. During the rising in the Presnya district, the geishas found themselves in the middle of the rebel area. A barricade was being built in Tver Street, a few yards from their house. People carried buckets of water from their yard in order to cement the stones and scrap iron with ice. The neighbouring yard was used by the insurgents as an assembly point, something between a first-aid post and a soup kitchen. Lara knew one of the boys who helped out at the assembly point. This was Pasha Antipov, whose father had been arrested as one of the organisers of the strike of the Moscow-Brest Line railway workers. Pasha now lived with some friends of his father's at Tvertsins, who also worked on the railway. Pasha Antipov was a clean, tidy boy with regular features and red hair parted in the middle. He was always smoothing it down with a brush and straightening his tunic or the school buckle on his belt. He had a great sense of humour and an unusual gift of observation, and kept himself and everyone else in fits of laughter by his clever imitations of everything he heard and saw. Lara could not help noticing the effect she had on the boy when she met him at the Tvertsins. He was so childishly simple that he no more thought of hiding his joy at seeing her than if she'd been some holiday landscape of birch trees, grass, and clouds in which he could delight without any risk of being laughed at. Hardly had she realized that she had an influence over him when she began unconsciously to use it, though it was not until several years later, and at a much further stage in their relationship, that she was to take his malleable, easy-going nature seriously in hand. By then, Pasha knew that he was head over ears in love with her and committed to her for life. Pasha Antipov and the other boys like him were now playing the most terrible and adult of games, war. And in this particular war they faced not only the normal risks of battle, but the danger of exile or hanging as well. Yet the way their woolen caps were tied at the back suggested that they were children who had still parents to look after them. It was as children that Lara thought of them. Their dangerous amusements had a bloom of innocence which they communicated to everything, to the evening, so shaggy with hoarfrost that it seemed more black than white, to the dark blue shadows in the yard, to the house across the road where the boys were hiding, and above all to the revolver shots which came from it. The boys are shooting, thought Lara. This was how she thought not only of Pasha, but of all those who were shooting all over Moscow. Good, decent boys, she thought. It's because they're good that they're shooting. The Guichars heard that the barricade might be shelled by the troops and that their house would be in danger. They had to find shelter elsewhere, and they thought of the Montenegro, the hotel at which they'd stayed when they first arrived in Moscow. Not to attract attention by carrying suitcases, they packed the most necessary things into 3 bundles, then they put off moving from day to day. Such were the patriarchal customs at Madame Guichard's dressmaking workshop that it had stayed open long after the beginning of the general strike. But one dull, cold afternoon there was a ring at the door. Someone had come to complain and to argue. Fetisova, the senior cutter, went to pour oil on troubled waters. A few moments later she called the seamstresses into the hall and introduced them to the visitor. He shook hands all round, clumsily and with emotion, and went away, having apparently settled something with Fetisova. The seamstresses came back into the workroom and began tying on their shawls and pulling on their skimpy winter coats. "What has happened?" asked Madame Guichard, hurrying in. "They're bringing us out, madam. We're on strike." "But I don't see. What harm have I done you?" Madame Guichard burst into tears. "Don't take on so, Amalia Karlovna. We've got nothing against you. We're very grateful to you. It's not just you and us. Everybody's doing the same, the whole world." "They can't make an exception just for you, Mamma, don't you see?" Lara tried to comfort her. "No one bears you any malice. On the contrary, all that's being done now is done in the name of humanity, in defense of the weak, for the good of women and children. You'll see, one day you and I will be better off because of it." But her mother couldn't understand. "It's always like this," she sobbed. "Just when I can't think straight, you come out with something that simply astounds me. People play a dirty trick on me, and you say it's all for my good." Rodya was at school. Lara and her mother wandered about, alone in the empty house. The unlit street stared emptily into the rooms, and the rooms returned its stare. "Let's go to the hotel, Mamma, before it gets dark," Lara begged. "Do come, Mamma, don't put it off. Let's go now." When they came out, the fresh air seemed as unfamiliar as after weeks of illness. Noises, rounded, as if turned on a lathe, rolled, echoing lightly, through crisp, frosty, nut-clean space. Shots and salvos smacked, thudded and plopped, flattening the distance into a pancake. Wonderful, thought Lara as she walked on. It would be difficult for Komarovsky to see her while this unrest continued. Her mother made it impossible for her to break with him. She couldn't say, "Mamma, please stop seeing him." If she did that, it would all come out. And what if it did? Why should that frighten her? Oh, God! Anything, if only it could end. In January 1906, the Gromykas held one of their musical evenings. There was to be a first performance of a violin sonata by a young composer, a pupil of Taneyev's. The preparations were begun the day before. The furniture was moved round in the drawing-room. In one corner the piano tuner struck the same chord dozens of times and scattered arpeggios like handfuls of beads. In the kitchen, chickens were being plucked, vegetables cleaned, and mustard mixed with olive oil for salad dressings. At the appointed time, the guests started to arrive. It was snowing, and whenever the front door opened you could see the air rush past, as though tangled in 1,000 knots by the flickering snow. Beyond the open side doors of the ballroom, the supper table gleamed white and long as a winter road. The play of light on frosted bottles of red Rowanberry vodka caught the eye. The crystal cruets on silver stands and the picturesque arrangement of meat and game captured the imagination, while the very napkins, folded into stiff pyramids, and the baskets of mauve cineraria smelling of almonds, seemed to whet the appetite. Not to delay the pleasure of terrestrial food too long, the company got down hastily to their spiritual repast. They sat down in rows, and the concert began. The sonata, expected to be dry, laboured, and boring, fulfilled those fears, and were terribly long drawn out as well. Yuri, Tonya, and Misha Gordon, who spent half his time at the Gromyko's, were sitting in the third row. "Yegorovna's making signs at you," Yuri whispered to Alexander Alexandrovitch, who sat immediately in front of him. Yegorovna, the Gromyko's white-haired old servant, stood in the doorway, and by staring desperately at Yuri and nodding with equal energy at Alexander Alexandrovitch, tried to make Yuri understand that she needed urgently to speak to the master. Alexander Alexandrovitch turned, gave her a reproachful look, and shrugged his shoulders, but she stood her ground. Soon they were talking across the room by signs, like a couple of deaf mutes. People were looking. Anna cast infuriated glances at her husband. He got up, blushing, and tiptoed round the edge of the room. "You ought to be ashamed, Yegorovna," he whispered. "What is it?" Yegorovna muttered in his ear. "What Montenegro?" "The hotel." "Well, what about it?" "They're asking for Monsieur Tishkovich. There's somebody of his dying." At the Montenegro Hotel, on their first arrival in Moscow, the Guichard family had lived in room 23, and in room 24 there had lived ever since the Montenegro had been founded the cellist Tishkovich, a bald, sweaty, kindly man in a wig, who joined his hands prayerfully and pressed them to his heart when he was trying to convince anyone of anything, and who played regularly at fashionable parties and concert halls. As neighbours, they had helped each other out, and this had brought them together. "It can't be done, Yegorovna," muttered Alexander Alexandrovitch. "When they've finished this piece, I'll tell them. Until then, I can't. They've sent the waiter with a cab to fetch him. Somebody's dying, I tell you, a lady, can't you understand? And I tell you it's impossible, as if a few minutes would make all that difference." He tiptoed back to his place with a worried frown, rubbing the bridge of his nose. At the end of the first movement, before the applause had died down, he went up to the musicians and told Tishkovich that there'd been some accident. They would have to stop playing. Then he turned to the audience and held up his hands for silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid the trio has to be interrupted. Monsieur Tishkovich has had some bad news. All our sympathy is with him. He has to leave us. I wouldn't like him to go by himself at such a moment. I'll go with him, in case he should need my help. Yuri, my boy, go and tell Simon to bring the carriage round. Ladies and gentlemen, I won't say goodbye. I beg you all to stay. I won't be long." The boys asked to go with him for the sake of the drive through the frosty night. Although the normal flow of life in Moscow had been restored since December, there were still occasional shots here and there. In reality, the Montenegro was only a stone's throw away, but the savage frost and fog had dislocated space and torn it apart, as if it were not the same the world over. The shaggy, ragged smoke of street fires, the crunch of footsteps, and the whine of passing sleighs all helped to give the two boys the impression that they'd been travelling for goodness knows how long and were on their way to some terrifyingly remote place. It was warm in the hotel vestibule, where the porter sat dozing behind the cloakroom counter. The hotel staff were being driven frantic. The incident in number 23 was only one more nuisance added to their daily vexations. Every minute the bells shrilled and numbers popped up behind the long glass panel of the box on the wall, showing which client in which room was going frantic and pestering the valet or the chambermaid without knowing what he wanted. At the moment, the doctor was giving an emetic to Madame Guichard and washing out her guts. Glasha, the maid, was run off her feet, mopping up the floor and carrying dirty slop pails out and clean ones in. It had all turned out quite differently from anything Alexander Alexandrovitch had expected. He had imagined a clean and dignified tragedy in a musician's life. But this was the devil of a business, sordid and scandalous, and certainly not for children. Inside room number 23, a lighted paraffin lamp, which ordinarily hung above the table, had been taken out of its stand and carried behind the wooden partition into the sleeping alcove. It stood on a low stool and lit the alcove garishly from below as though by footlights. The alcove stank of bugs and had a dusty curtain to conceal it from the main room and the lobby. But the curtain had been flung aside, and in the confusion no one had thought of closing it. Madame Guichard had tried to poison herself with iodine. The room had the tart, astringent smell of green walnuts when their husks are still soft and blackened at a touch. Behind the partition, the maid was mopping up the floor, and lying on the bed was a half-naked woman, wet with tears, water and sweat, her hair stuck together. She was holding her head over a bucket and crying loudly. The boys turned away at once, so shameful and unmannerly did they feel it was to look in her direction. At last someone behind the partition had the sense to draw the curtain. "Monsieur Tishkovich, my dear, where's your hand? Give me your hand," the woman was saying, choking with tears and nausea. "Oh, I've been through such horrors. I've had such terrible suspicions. But happily it's all turned out to be nonsense, just my disordered imagination. Just think what a relief." "Calm yourself, Amalia Karlovna, I beg you. How awkward all this is, upon my word, how very awkward." Excruciatingly embarrassed, Yuri and Misha didn't know where to look. They stared straight in front of them into the shadowy depth of the main room. The walls were hung with photographs. There was a bookshelf filled with musical scores, a desk piled with papers and fashion journals, and beyond the round table with the crochet cover, a girl was asleep in an armchair, one arm flung over the back and her face pressed against the cushion. She must have been dead tired to be able to sleep in spite of all the noise and excitement. "We'll be off now," Alexander Alexandrovitch said gruffly to the boys. There'd been no sense in their coming, and to stay any longer would be indecent. "As soon as Monsieur Tishkovich is ready—" But it was not Tishkovich who came out from behind the partition, but a thick-set, portly, self-confident man. Carrying the lamp above his head, he went over to the table and replaced it on its stand. The light woke up the girl. She smiled at him, screwing up her eyes and stretching. At the sight of the stranger, Misha started and stared as if he couldn't take his eyes away. He pulled Yuri's sleeve and tried to whisper to him. Meanwhile, the girl and the man were acting a dumb scene. Not a word passed their lips, only their eyes met. But the understanding between them had a terrifying quality of black magic, as if he were the master of a puppet show, and she were the puppet obedient to his every gesture. A tired smile puckered her eyes and loosened her lips, but in answer to his amused glance she gave him a sly wink of complicity. Both of them were pleased that it had all ended so well. Their secret was safe, and Madame Guichard's attempted suicide had failed. Yuri devoured them with his eyes. The scene between the captive girl and her master were both incommunicably mysterious and shamelessly frank. New and conflicting feelings crowded painfully in Yuri's heart. Here was the very thing which he, Tonia, and Misha had endlessly discussed and had dismissed as vulgar, the force which so frightened and attracted them, and which they controlled so easily from a safe distance by words. And now here it was, this force in front of Yuri's very eyes, concrete, real, and yet confused and veiled, as in a dream. And where was Yuri's childish philosophy now? And what was he to do? "Do you know who that man is?" said Misha when they came out into the street. Yuri, busy with his thoughts, did not reply. "He's the one who made your father drink and caused his death. The lawyer who was in the train with him, you remember, I told you." But Yuri was thinking about the girl and the future, not about his father and the past. By the spring of 1906, before Lara was in the top form at school, her liaison with Komarovsky had driven her beyond the limits of her endurance. He was clever at exploiting her wretchedness, and reminded her when it suited him of her dishonour, without seeming to do so. These hints brought her to just that state of confusion to which a voluptuary needs to reduce a woman, and left her powerless to resist the nightmare of sensuality which terrified her whenever she awoke from it. It seemed that there would be no end to it. But that spring, as she sat through a history lesson at the end of term, thinking of the holidays when even school and homework would no longer stand between her and Komarovsky, she came to a sudden decision which altered the course of her life. It was a hot morning, and a storm was brewing. Through the open classroom windows came the distant drone of the town, as monotonous as a beehive, and the shrieks of children playing in the yard. Lara tore a page out of an exercise book and wrote to her neighbour, Nadia Kologrivova, "Nadia, I want to live away from Mother. Help me to find a teaching job, as well paid as possible. You know lots of rich people." Nadia wrote back, "Mother and Father are looking for a governess for Lipa. Why not come to us? It would be wonderful. You know how fond they are of you." Lara spent the next 3 years at the Kologrivovs, as safe as in a stronghold. No one bothered her, and even her mother and her brother, from whom she felt estranged, kept out of her way. Kologrivov was a brilliant businessman of a new kind. He despised and hated the decaying order with a double hatred, both as a man rich enough to outbid the treasury, and as one who had risen to these fabulous heights from a humble origin. He sheltered political criminals in his house, and hired lawyers to defend them, and it was said of him as a joke that he was so keen on subsidizing the revolution and dispossessing himself that he fomented strikes at his own factory. After 3 years of this carefree life, Lara received a visit from her brother Rodya. Swaying affectedly backwards and forwards on his long legs, and for dramatic emphasis talking through his nose, he told her that the cadets of his year had collected money for a farewell gift to the head of the academy, and entrusted it to him, asking him to choose and buy the present. This money he had gambled away 2 days ago down to the last kopeck. Having told Lara, he flopped into an armchair and burst into tears. Lara sat frozen with horror. Rodya went on through his sobs. "Last night I went to see Komarovsky. He refused to talk about it with me, but he said if you wished him to, and he said that although you no longer loved any of us, your power over him was still so great. Lara, darling, one word from you would be enough. You realize what this means for me, what a disgrace it is, how it affects my honor as a cadet. Oh, go to him. What does it cost you? You can't want me to make this good with my life. Your life? Your honor as a cadet?" Indignantly she paced the room. "Have you any idea what you're asking? Do you realize what he's making you do? Year after year I slave away, and now you come along and sit about and don't care if everything I've built up is scattered to the winds. To hell with you. Go ahead, shoot yourself. What do I care?" She paused for breath. "How much do you need?" 690-odd rubles. Say 700 in round figures," he added, after a slight hesitation. "Rodya, you must be mad. Do you realize how long it takes an ordinary person like myself to earn as much as that by honest work?" She broke off, and after a short silence said coldly, as if to a stranger, "All right, come tomorrow." She got the money from Kologrivov. Yuri, Misha Gordon and Tonya were all due to graduate from university in the spring of 1912, Yuri in medicine, Tonya in law, and Misha in philosophy. Everything in Yuri's mind was mixed up together and misplaced, but everything was sharply his own, his views, his habits, and his inclinations. He was unusually impressionable, and the freshness and novelty of his vision were remarkable. Though he was greatly drawn to art and history, he scarcely hesitated over the choice of his career. He was interested in physics and natural science, and believed that a man should do something useful in his practical life. he settled on medicine. Ever since his school days, he'd dreamed of writing a book in prose, a book of impressions of life in which he would conceal, like buried sticks of dynamite, the most striking things he'd so far seen and thought about. He was too young to write such a book. Instead, he wrote poetry. He was like a painter who spent his life making sketches for a big picture he had in mind. The vigour and originality of his poems made Yuri forgive himself what he regarded as the sin of their conception, for he believed that originality and vigour alone could give reality to a work of art, and that without them, art was utterly useless, superfluous, and a waste of time. Laura's work at the Kologrevovs did not prevent her from finishing school and starting on a university course. In the spring of 1911, her pupil Lipa finished school. In this wealthy household, where Laura was accepted as a member of the family, no one reminded her of her debt or indeed remembered it. She would have paid it back long before if it had not been for her secret expenses. Unknown to Pasha, she sent money to his father in Siberia and secretly kept his expenses down by paying part of his board and lodging directly to his landlady. Pasha, who was a little younger than Laura, loved her madly and obeyed her slightest wish. After specializing in science at school, he had, on her advice, studied Greek and Latin in order to take an arts degree. It was her dream that after they had both graduated in the following year, they would marry and go out as schoolteachers to some provincial capital in the Urals. Yuri left for Moscow a week later. During the long journey, his thoughts swarmed and whirled and seemed to move in two main circles, two skeins, which constantly tangled and untangled themselves. In one circle were his thoughts of Tonia, their home and their former settled life, where everything, down to the smallest detail, had its poetry and its sincerity and warmth. Yuri felt anxious about this life. He wanted it to be safe and whole, and after 2 years of separation, rushing back to it in his express train, he longed already to be there. Here, too, were his loyalty to the revolution and his admiration for it. The revolution in the sense in which it was understood and accepted by the middle classes and the students in 1905. This familiar circle also contained the foretaste of new things. In it were those omens and promises which before the war, between 1912 and 1914, had appeared in Russian thought, art and life, in the destiny of Russia as a whole, and in his own. New things were also in the other circle of his thoughts, but how different, how unlike the first. These new things were not familiar, not led up to by the old. They were unchosen, prescribed by reality, and as sudden and inevitable as an earthquake. Among them was the war, with its bloodshed and its horrors, its homelessness, savagery, and isolation, its trials and the worldly wisdom which it taught. Here, too, were the lonely little towns where you were stranded by the war, and the people with whom it threw you together. Such a new thing, too, was the revolution itself, not the one idealized in student fashion in 1905, but this new upheaval, born of the war, pitiless, bloody, elemental, a soldier's revolution, led by its professionals, the Bolsheviks. Among his new thoughts was Nurse Antipova, caught by the war at the back of beyond, with her completely unknown life. Antipova, who never blamed anyone, yet whose very silence was almost a reproach, mysteriously reserved and so strong in her reserve. Here, too, were Yuri's honest effort to put all his strength into not loving her, as honest as his striving all his life to love everyone, not only his family and his friends. It was late afternoon when Yuri's cab slowly made its way from the station through the dense crowd in Moscow's Smolensky Square. It seemed to Yuri that even then the crowd hung about the market only from habit, that already there was no reason for it to be there, because the stalls were covered up and even locked, and there was nothing to buy or sell in the littered square, which nobody swept. And it seemed to him that already he saw, shrinking against the walls, thin, decently dressed old men and women, who stood like a silent reproach to the passers-by, wordlessly offering what no one needed, artificial flowers, coffee percolators with glass lids and whistles, black net evening dresses, and uniforms of offices that had been abolished. The cab turned into a side street. Yuri was struck by the quantities of old newspapers and posters torn down from the walls and fences, littering the streets. The wind pulled them one way, hooves, wheels and feet pushed them the other. They passed several crossroads, and there was Yuri's house at the corner of two side streets. The cab stopped. Yuri caught his breath, and his heart hammered as he got out, walked up to the front door, and rang the bell at the side. Nothing happened. He rang again. As there was still no reply, he went on ringing at short, anxious intervals. He was still ringing when he saw that the door had been opened by Tonya, and that she stood holding it wide. The unexpectedness of it so dumbfounded them both that neither of them heard the other cry out. But as the door, held wide open by Tonya, was in itself a welcome and almost an embrace, they soon recovered and rushed into each other's arms. A moment later they were both talking at once. "First of all, is everybody well?" Yes, don't worry, everything's all right. Why didn't you send a telegram? Markel will take your things up. I suppose you got worried that Yegorovna didn't let you in. She's in the country. You're thinner. But how young you look, and so pretty. Wait a minute. I'll pay the driver. Yegorovna has gone to try and get some flour. All the other servants have been sent away. There's only one girl now, Nyusha. You don't know her. She's looking after Sasha. There's no one else. Everybody's been told that you're coming. They're all longing to see you. Misha, Dudorov, everyone. How is Sasha? It's all right, thank God. He's just woken up. If you weren't just off the train, with all this typhus about, we could have gone to him at once. Is your father at home? Didn't anyone write to you? He's at the borough council from morning till night. He's the chairman. Yes, can you believe it? They went in and shut the front door behind them. "Which way are you going?" asked Yuri. "Don't we go through the drawing room any more?" "Oh, of course you don't know. We've given up the ground floor to the Agricultural Academy. It's too much to heat in winter, anyway. By the way, we don't say rooms anymore. It's called living space nowadays. Come on, this way. We go up the back stairs. I'm very glad you've given up those rooms. The hospital I've been in was also a private house." "They say there'll be all sorts of horrors this winter," Tonya said, leading the way up the stairs. "They say there won't be any firewood or enough food or water or light. They'll abolish money. No supplies will be coming in. Yes, that's what they're saying everywhere. It does look as if there's a bad time coming, but we'll manage. It can't be the end of everything. Let me tell you what I plan to do, Yuri. We'll set aside a corner somewhere at the top of the house, say 2 or 3 rooms, communicating ones, and we'll keep those for ourselves and Father and Sasha and Nyosha, and we'll give up all the rest of the house. We'll put up a partition and have our own door, like in a flat. We'll put one of those metal stoves in the middle room, with a pipe through the window, and we'll do all our laundry and our cooking and our entertaining, all in this one room. Like that, we'll make the most of the fuel, and who knows, with God's help, we'll get through the winter." "Of course we'll get through it. There's no question. That's a splendid idea." During the next few days, Yuri realized how isolated he was. It was no one's fault, he thought. He'd simply got what he asked for. His friends had become strangely dim and colourless. Not one of them had kept his own outlook, his own world. They'd been much more vivid in his memory. He must have overestimated them in the past. It had been easy enough to do so, as long as the order of things had been such that people with means could indulge their follies and eccentricities at the expense of the poor. The fooling, the right to idleness enjoyed by the few, while the majority suffered, could itself create an illusion of genuine character and originality. But how quickly, once the lower classes had risen, and the rich had lost their privileges, had these people faded? How effortlessly, how happily had they given up the habit of independent thought, which, at this rate, could never in fact have been genuinely theirs. The only people with whom Yuri now felt at home were Tonya, her father, and 2 or 3 of his fellow doctors, people in plain, ordinary jobs, who got on with them decently and modestly, without fuss or rhetoric. August had gone by, and now September was nearly over. Winter was at hand, and in the world of men the air was heavy with something as inexorable as the coming death of nature. It was on everybody's lips. Food and logs had to be got in. But in those days of the triumph of materialism, matter had become an abstract notion, and food and firewood were replaced by the problems of alimentation and fuel supply. The people in the towns were as helpless as children in the face of the unknown, of that unknown which swept every known usage aside and left nothing but desolation in its wake, although it was the offspring and creation of the towns. People were still talking and deceiving themselves as their daily life struggled on, limping and shuffling to its unknown destination. But Yuri saw it as it was. He could see that it was doomed, and that he, and such as he, were sentenced to destruction. Ordeals were ahead, perhaps death. Their days were numbered, and these days were running out before his eyes. What saved his reason were the everyday details of his life, his work, his worries. His wife, his child, the need to earn, these were his salvation, the humble ritual daily round, his job, his sick calls. He understood that he was a pygmy before the monstrous machine of the future. He both feared and loved that future, and was secretly proud of it, and, as though for the last time, as if saying goodbye, he was avidly aware of the trees and clouds, and of the people walking in the streets, of the great Russian city struggling through misfortune. He was back in his job at the hospital. It was still called the Hospital of the Holy Cross, although the community of that name had been dissolved. No one so far had thought of a more suitable name. In addition to his normal duties, the director had put him in charge of statistics. Endless questionnaires went through his hands, endless forms had to be filled in. Death rate, sickness rate, the earnings of the staff, the level of their political consciousness and their part in the elections, the perpetual shortage of food, fuel, medicines, everything had to be checked and reported to the Central Statistical Bureau. Yuri worked at his old table by the staff-room window, stacked with charts and forms of every size and shape. Occasionally he snatched time, and in addition to notes for his works on medicine, wrote his Mannikins and Men, a gloomy diary of those days, made up of prose and verse and every kind of odds and ends, coloured by his feeling that half the world had ceased to be itself and was playing goodness only knew what part. That winter there was fighting in the streets between the cadets who were supporting the provisional government and the garrison soldiers who were backing the Bolsheviks. A few days after the street fighting started, Yuri brought home a newspaper, a late extra, printed on one side only. It gave the official announcement from Petersburg that a Soviet of People's Commissars had been formed, and that Soviet power and the dictatorship of the proletariat were established in Russia. There followed the first decrees of the new government, and various brief news items received by telegraph and telephone. The winter was dark, hungry, and cold, spent in watching the destruction of all that was familiar and the changing of all the foundations of life, and in inhuman efforts to keep hold of life as it slipped out of their grasp. There were 3 such terrible winters, one after the other, and not all that now seems to have happened in the winter of 1917 to 18 really happened then. Some of it may have been later. These 3 winters have now merged into one, and it's difficult to tell them apart. Most people's meals consisted of boiled millet and fish soup made of herring heads, followed by the rest of the herring as a second course. There was also gruel made by boiling whole grains of wheat or rye. This was to be the staple food of the majority for a long time to come. The old life and the new ways did not yet interlock. They were not yet at daggers drawn, as when the Civil War broke out a year later, but neither did they have much connection with each other. They were like 2 parts of a puzzle set down side by side, and which could not be made to fit. Everywhere there were new elections for the running of housing, trade, industry, and municipal services. Commissars were being appointed to each, men in black leather jerkins, with unlimited powers and an iron will, armed with means of intimidation and revolvers, who shaved little and slept less. They knew the slinking bourgeois breed, the average holders of cheap government stocks, and they spoke to them without the slightest pity and with Mephistophelian smiles as to petty thieves caught in the act. These were the people who reorganized everything in accordance with the plan, and company after company, enterprise after enterprise, became Bolshevized. The Hospital of the Holy Cross was now known as the Second Reformed. Many things had changed in it. Part of the staff had been dismissed, and others had resigned because they didn't find the work sufficiently rewarding. The Zhivagos were tried to the limits of endurance. They had nothing, and they were starving. Yuri went to see a party member whose life he'd once saved. This man helped him as far as he could, but the civil war was beginning, and he was hardly ever in Moscow. Besides, in keeping with his principles, he looked upon the difficulties of those days as natural, and concealed the fact that he himself went hungry. It was about this time that Tonya and her father decided that they'd have to go away for a year or two, away from the chaos of the big towns and back to the land. They thought of the land belonging to Tonya's mother's family, the old Kruger place near Yuriatin. That was certainly far enough away, and at least they'd be able to grow their own vegetables there. There was no point in dying without a struggle, like sheep. It was the end of March. As usual, the last few days of this month were the first warm days of the year, a false spring, to be followed by a much colder spell. The Zhivagos were getting ready to leave for the former Varikino estate near Yuriatin, far away in the Urals. Yuri was against the journey. "You say that we must manage as best we can for the next couple of years," said Tonya, "until the new system of land tenure is established, and we can get a plot to grow vegetables outside Moscow. But how are we to last out until then? That's the really important point, and you haven't told us." "All right," Yuri gave in. "What bothers me is the complete uncertainty. We're going blindfold into the blue to a place we know nothing about. Of the 3 people who live in Varikino, mother and grandmother are dead, and Grandfather Kruger is being held as a hostage. That is, if he's still alive. You know he made a sort of deal in the last year of the war, sold the forests and the factories, or put the title deeds in the name of someone else, a bank or a private person, I don't know. In fact, we don't know anything. Who does the estate belong to now? I don't mean whose property is it, I don't care a damn, but who's responsible for it? Who runs it? Is the timber being cut? Are the factories working? And above all, who is in power of that part of the country, or rather who will be by the time we get there? You're relying on Mikulitsin, the old estate manager, to see us through, but who's to tell us if he's still there, or even if he's still alive? However, I don't want to go on raising difficulties. You've made up your minds, and I've agreed. There's no point in putting it off. We must find out exactly what one does about travelling nowadays." On the day before they left, there was a snowstorm. Grey clouds of spinning snow flew up into the sky, came back to earth as a white whirlwind, and blew away into the dark distance of the street, shrouding it in white. All the luggage was packed. The flat, with such things as remained in it, was being left in the care of an elderly couple. The chairs and tables had been pushed against the walls, the curtains taken down, and there was a pile of bundles in the corner. The rooms, stripped of their winter comfort and watched through the bare windows by the storm, reminded each of them of past sorrows. Yuri thought of his mother's death, and Tonya and Alexander Alexandrovich of the death and funeral of Anna. They felt that this was their last night in the house, and they would never see it again. And although, to avoid distressing one another, they did not speak of their foreboding, it saddened them, and they struggled with tears as they looked back over their life under this roof. On the 5th day of the journey, the Zhivagos invited the cooperativist Kostoyed to dinner in their compartment. Kostoyed was one of a group of conscripts called up for forced labor from Petrograd and now on their way to the east. He was a grey-haired revolutionary belonging to the Labour Cooperative Party who'd been in all the penal settlements of the old regime and was now discovering those of the new. He sat in the corner, sucking a leg of hair with a loud wheezing noise. The hair had been obtained by Tonya at one of the country stations at which the train had stopped en route. An old peasant woman had given it to her in exchange for a towel embroidered with horse collars and wheels. Kostoyed finished his drumstick, sucked his fingers clean, wiped them on his handkerchief, thanked his hosts, and said, "A really excellent roast hare, excellent. But of course, to conclude from this, as you seem to do, Zhivago, that the peasants are flourishing is rash, to say the least, if you'll forgive my saying so." "Oh, come," said Yuri, "look at all these stations we stop at. The trees and fences are still standing. They haven't been chopped down for firewood, as in Moscow. And the markets, wonderful. At least somewhere life is still going on, and people are pleased with it. Not everyone is wretched. Isn't that a justification of everything?" "It would be, if it were so. But it simply isn't. You should just look at what's going on in the interior, anywhere 50 or 100 miles from the railway. The peasants are in revolt, there are ceaseless risings. You'll say that they're fighting the Reds or the Whites indiscriminately, whoever may be in power, that they're simply against any established authority because they don't know what they want. Allow me to differ. The peasant knows very well what he wants, better than you or I do, but he wants something quite different. When the revolution came and woke him up, he decided that this was the fulfillment of his dream, his ancient dream of living anarchically on his own land, by the work of his own hands, in complete independence, and without owing anything to anyone. Instead of that, he found that he'd only exchanged the old oppression of the Tsarist state for the new, much harsher yoke of the revolutionary superstate. Can you wonder that the villagers are restless and can't settle down? You say that they're happy. No, there are a lot of things you don't know, my dear fellow. And I'm afraid it looks as if you don't want to know them. Oh, all right, I dare say I don't, Yuri answered. Why, for goodness sake, do I have to know everything and worry myself sick over every blessed thing? History hasn't consulted me. I have to put up with whatever happens, so why shouldn't I ignore the facts? You tell me it's unrealistic, but where is reality in Russia today? My belief is that it's been frightened out of existence. It's true that I want to believe that the peasants are better off and the villagers are prosperous. If I can't believe that, then what am I to do? Whom am I to believe? What am I to live by? He made a despairing gesture, and leaving the argument to his father-in-law, moved away and stared dejectedly out of the window. The train, creeping at a snail's pace for fear of running off the tracks, which the wind had powdered with snow and which no one had cleared, pulled up beside a lifeless, burnt-out ruin. This was all that was left of the station Lower Kelmes, its name still faintly legible on its blackened front. As they got into the Urals and approached the mining region, the runs were shorter, the halts more frequent. More people got on and off at the small stations. Instead of settling down and going to sleep, those who had only a short way to go found seats anywhere near the door or in the middle of the coach and sat up arguing in low voices about local matters intelligible only to themselves. From the hints dropped by such local people in the past 3 days, Yuri gathered that here the Whites were getting the best of the fighting, and had seized or were about to seize Yuriatin, and also that unless he'd misheard the name, or his old friend had a namesake, the White forces were led by Galyulin, whom he'd last seen in Melyutsevo. Not wishing to alarm his family by these unconfirmed rumours, he said nothing to them for the time being. Yuri woke up in the early hours of the night, filled with an obscure happiness so strong that it had aroused him. The train was standing still. The station was bathed in the glassy dusk of a white night. Something subtle and powerful in this luminous darkness suggested a vast and open landscape, as though the station were high up on a mountain range. 2 men were talking underneath his bunk. Well, have they had their tails twisted yet? They keeping quiet now? The shopkeepers, you mean? Yeah, the corn dealers. Feed out of your hand. As soon as a few were bumped off by way of example, all the others became as good as gold. A fine has been imposed on the district, 40,000 puds of the finest ground corn. Well, so what? It's rich soil, right in the thick of the corn trade. From here on, along the Rinva until you get to Yuriatin, it's village after village, wharf after wharf, one wholesaler after another. Don't shout. You'll wake people up. All right. The first speaker yawned. How about getting to sleep? Looks as if we're moving. The train, however, stayed where it was. But the rumble of another train approached swiftly from behind, bursting into a deafening roar as it drew level, and an old-fashioned express thundered past along the parallel track. It hooted, winked its tail light, and vanished in the distance ahead. That's bad, continued the man in the lower berth. Goodness knows when we'll be off now. That was a special armoured train. Must be Strelnikov. Must be him. He's a wild beast when it comes to counter-revolutionaries. He's after Galyulin. Who's that? Galyulin, you know. They say he's outside Yuriatin with a Czech covering force. He's seized the harbour, the rotten turnip, and he's hanging on. The following day, the train moved into the suburbs of Yuriatin and stopped again. The town lay just ahead of them, clearly visible from the train. One of its suburbs was on fire. The smoke drifted across the sky, looking like a horse's mane blowing in the wind. The train did not move all day, and that night it was too hot and stuffy in the carriage to sleep. Yuri's pillow was soaked in sweat. Carefully, not to wake the others, he got down from his bunk and rolled back the carriage doors. Sticky, damp heat struck him in the face as if he'd walked into a cobweb in a cellar. From ahead there came an even rumbling, which made Yuri, with his experience of the war, prick up his ears. Artillery, he decided, after listening to the calmly echoing, low, sustained note. He walked down the length of the train and round the front carriage. A sentry with a rifle rose in his path. "Where are you going?" the man said curtly. "Who are you?" "I'm a doctor from Moscow. My family and I are passengers on this train. Here are my papers." "To hell with you. I don't need any papers to know what kind of a doctor you are. Come with me. We'll see what the boss says." He's taking me for someone else, thought Yuri. Clearly it was no use arguing. Better follow him. They walked down the track towards the town. A little way ahead was another stationary train. It was the armoured express that had passed them in the night several days earlier. It was Strelnikov's train. When they reached the train ahead, the guard, after giving the password to the sentry, took Yuri into the first coach. He led Yuri down a narrow passage to a wide central compartment and left him there while he went to report to Strelnikov. It was a clean, comfortable room with several tidy, well-dressed people working in complete silence. Yuri had had a very different idea of the background of Strelnikov, the famous non-party military expert who was the pride and terror of the region. But no doubt the real centre of his activities lay elsewhere, closer to the Staff HQ and to the field of military operations. This could only be his personal suite, his private office and sleeping quarters. Hence the stillness, rather like the quiet of a hydro, with cork floors and attendants in soft slippers. The office was the old dining car, carpeted and with several desks in it. Strelnikov came in with long, vigorous strides and stood in the middle of the room. It was clear at once that this man was a finished product of the will. So completely was he himself, the self he chose to be, that everything about him struck one immediately as a model of its kind. His well-proportioned, handsomely set head, his eager step, his long legs, his knee boots, which may well have been muddy but which looked clean, and his grey serge tunic, which may have been creased but looked as if it were made of the best linen and had just been pressed. Who, in reality, was Strelnikov? That he should have reached and held his position was remarkable, for he was a non-party man, and though born in Moscow had been totally unknown. He'd gone straight from the university to a school-teaching job in the provinces, and in the war he'd been captured and reported missing, believed killed. He had only recently come back from prison in Germany. He was put forward and vouched for by Tivertsin, a railway worker of advanced political views, in whose family he'd lived as a child. Those who controlled appointments were impressed by him. His unbridled revolutionary fervour fitted the spirit of the times and stood out by its sincerity and its fanaticism. He justified the confidence of the authorities. His fighting record over the past few months included the burning of Lower Kelmes, the suppression of the Gubasovo peasants, who'd put up armed resistance to food levies, and of the men of the 14th Line Regiment who'd plundered a food convoy. Finally, when the white pressure from the north increased and the position became grave, Strelnikov was entrusted with new responsibilities, military, strategic and operational. His activities produced immediate results. Strelnikov, the shooter, knew that rumour had nicknamed him Rastrelnikov, the executioner. He took it calmly. He was disturbed by nothing. Strelnikov politely concealed any surprise or annoyance he might have felt at Yuri's presence. He addressed his staff, treating him as one of themselves. He said, "Congratulations, we've driven them back. It all seems more like playing at war than like serious business, because they're as Russian as we are, only stuffed with nonsense. They won't give it up, so we have to beat it out of them. Their commander, Galyulin, was my friend. His origin is even more proletarian than mine. We grew up in the same house. He's done a great deal for me in my life, and I'm deeply indebted to him. And here I am, rejoicing that we've thrown them back beyond the river and perhaps even further." He paused for a moment, then turned towards Yuri and looked him over. "This man," he said sharply to the guard. "Nonsense, he's nothing like him, fool." He laughed. and said to Yuri, "My apologies, comrade. They mistook you for someone else. My guard made a mistake. You're free to go. Where's the comrade's labour book? Ah, may I just have a glance? Zhivago, Dr. Zhivago, Moscow." He paused. "Where are you going, comrade?" "To Varikino." "A Moscow doctor going to Varikino? That's strange. Why should you leave Moscow for such an out-of-the-way place?" "That's just the idea. In search of quiet, retirement and obscurity." "Dear me, how romantic. Varikino. I know most of the places here. That used to be Kruger's estate. You aren't related to him by any chance? You don't happen to be his heir?" "Why the irony? Being his heir has nothing to do with it, though it is true that my wife—" "Ah, so you see. But if you're feeling nostalgic for the whites, I'm going to disappoint you. We've cleared the district. And then a doctor, an army medical officer, and we're at war. That really is my business. You are a deserter. I have been twice wounded and invalided out. Next you'll be handing me a reference from the People's Commissariat of Education to prove that you're a Soviet citizen, or a sympathizer, or entirely loyal. These are apocalyptic times, my dear sir. This is the last judgment. This is a time for angels with flaming swords, and winged beasts from the abyss, not for sympathizers and loyal doctors. However, I told you you were free, and I won't take back my word, but remember, it's for this once. Take care, comrade doctor. Take care." Tonya stood on the platform at Tofyanaya, counting her family and her luggage over and over again to make sure that nothing had been left on the train. Tofyanaya was 2 stops beyond Yuriatin on the railway line, and here there were no signs of the turmoil they'd seen in Yuriatin. They were struck by the silence, emptiness, and tidiness of the station. It seemed strange not to be surrounded by a milling, cursing mob. The station lay hidden in a birchwood. When the train drew in, it had grown dark inside the carriage, as if it were evening. Now the shadows of the scarcely stirring trees moved lightly over their hands and faces, over the ground, and the station walls and roofs, and over the platform with its clean, damp yellow sand. It was cool in the thicket, and the singing of the birds in it had an equally cool sound. All at once Tonya cried out, "How lovely!" She couldn't say any more. She broke into tears. At the sound of her crying, a little old man in a station master's uniform came out and shuffled across to them. Touching the peak of his red-topped cap, he asked politely, "Would the young lady like something from the station medicine chest for her nerves?" "Oh, it's nothing, thank you. She'll be all right in a minute," said her father. "It's the anxiety and worry of the journey that does it," said the station master. "And then this African heat, which is so rare in our latitude, and then on top of everything else, the happenings in Yuriatin. We saw the fire from the train as we went by. You're from Moscow, if I'm not mistaken." "Yes. Little wonder, then, that the lady's nerves are upset. They say there isn't a stone left standing there." "Not quite as bad as that," replied her father. "People exaggerate, but we've certainly had a difficult time. This is my daughter, and that's her husband, and that's their little boy. How do you do? Delighted. We want to get to Varikino. Is it far from here?" "Varikino? That's why I keep wondering who your daughter reminds me of. That explains everything. Ivan Ernestovich Kruger and I built this road together. I'll call one of the men. We'll see about a cart. Donat, run over to the tea room and see what can be done. Bacchus was hanging round there this morning. Tell him 4 passengers for Varikino, new arrivals. They've hardly got any luggage. Tell him, and you look sharp about it. And now, lady, may I give you a piece of fatherly advice? I purposely didn't ask you how closely you were related to Ivan Ernestovich Kruger. Be very careful what you say about it. You can't be hail fellow well met with everyone in times like these." The horse was a white mare which had recently foaled, and the driver a lop-eared old man with floppy hair as white as a white owl. The foal, curly-haired and black as night, like a painted toy, ran after its mother and the cart, kicking out its soft-boned legs. The travellers clung to the sides of the cart as it jolted over the ruts. Their hearts were at peace. Their dream was coming true. They were almost at the end of their journey. The last hours of the still, clear day lingered generously, with a lavish splendour. Their way led sometimes through woods and sometimes across open fields. Everything pleased and astonished them, above all the unceasing chatter of their cranky old driver, in whose speech archaic idioms, traces of Tartar influence and local oddities of language mixed with those of his own invention. Evening was coming, and their shadows, growing longer and longer, ran ahead of them as they approached Varikino. Their first meeting with the Mikolitsins took place in the yard of the manager's house. It was a painful scene which began in silence and ended in noisy confusion and absurdity. Helen, Mikolitsin's wife, was coming home across the yard from her evening walk in the woods. Her husband was coming out of the house to meet her. Suddenly, into the midst of this peaceful setting, the station cart rolled up smartly with a loud clatter of wheels over the cobbles. The passengers got out, and Alexander Alexandrovitch, humming and hawing and taking off and putting on his hat, began to explain. Their hosts were struck dumb with amazement. Their genuine speechlessness lasted for several minutes. So did the sincere and appalled confusion of their wretched guests, who were dying of shame. The silence was finally broken by Mikolitsin. "I don't understand. What do you think this is? The South, where the whites are, and there's plenty of bread? Why did your choice fall on us? What on earth brought you here of all places? Did you stop to think what a burden you'd be imposing on us? But heavens above, you misunderstand us. There's no question of intruding on you, of upsetting your peace of mind. What we need is a very small thing. All we're thinking of is a corner in any old empty tumble-down hut, and a strip of land that happens to be going to waste because nobody wants it, so that we can grow our food, and a cartload of firewood from the forest where there's no one to see us take it. Is this really asking too much? Is it such an imposition?" "No, but what has this to do with us? Why should we be chosen for this honor rather than anyone else?" "Because we've heard of you, and we hoped you would have heard of us, so that we would not be coming to complete strangers." "Ah, so it's because of Kruger, because you're related to him. How can you even bring yourselves to admit such a thing at a time like this?" Mikolitsin had devoted his youth to the liberation movement, to working for the revolution, and his only fear had been that he would not live to see it, or that when it came it would be too moderate, not bloody enough for his radical dream. Now it had come, it had exceeded his boldest expectations. But he, the born and faithful champion of the proletariat, who'd been among the first to set up a works committee and to hand over the control of the factory to the men, had been left high and dry. So far from being at the centre of affairs, here he was in a remote village from which the workers, some of whom were Mensheviks, had fled. And now, what was this ridiculous nonsense on top of everything? These uninvited survivors of Kruger's family seemed to him fate's crowning joke, a deliberate trick. "This is beyond all reason," he said. "Do you realize the danger you'll put me in? A nice thought to have to face a firing squad on your account." "Oh, come, really, be sensible, for goodness' sake," said Alexander Alexandrovitch. A little later, Mikolitsin relented and said, "Well, there isn't any point in squabbling in the yard. We'd better go inside. Not, of course, that I can see any good coming of it, but we aren't heathens. We won't drive you out into the forest to be eaten by bears. I think, Helen, darling, we'd better put them in the palm room for the moment, next to the study. We'll see later where they can settle down. We can probably find them a cottage in the park. Now do come inside." The following winter, when Yuri had more time, he began to keep a diary about their new life at Varikino. "What happiness it is to work from dawn to dusk for your family and yourself," he wrote, "to build a roof over their heads, to till the soil to feed them, to create your own world in imitation of the Creator of the universe. So many new thoughts come into your head when your hands are busy with hard physical work, when your mind has set you a task which can be achieved by physical effort, and which brings its reward in joy and success, when for 6 hours on end you dig or hammer, scorched by the life-giving breath of the sky. Our use of the land is illegal. We've taken the law into our own hands, and we conceal what we're doing from the state. The wood we cut is stolen, and it's no excuse when we steal from the state that the property belonged to Kruger. We are saved by Mikolitsin, who covers up for us. He lives in much the same way as we do, and by being far from the town, where, thank goodness, they don't know, so far, what we're up to. I keep quiet about being a doctor because I don't want to restrict my freedom, but there's always some good soul somewhere who gets to know. So they trudged 20 miles to look for me and bring a hen or a few eggs or a little butter by way of a fee. And in the end I can't refuse to accept it, because people don't believe that medicine is effective unless they pay for it. So my practice brings me a little. We are living in 2 rooms in a wooden annex at the back of the old house. In Anna Ivanovna's childhood, Kruger used it for special members of the household staff, the dressmaker, the housekeeper, and the retired nanny. It was pretty dilapidated when we came, but we repaired it fairly quickly. We've been lucky. The autumn was dry and warm. It gave us time to dig up the potatoes before the rains and the cold weather. We also put down 2 barrels of salted cucumbers and 2 of sauerkraut prepared by Tonya. Fresh cabbages hang in pairs from the timbers. There are carrots buried in the dry sand, and radishes and beet and turnips and peas and beans are stored in the loft. There's enough firewood in the outhouse to last us till the spring. At the beginning, during the spring and summer, we had a very hard time. It was all we could do to struggle along, but now we can relax in the winter evenings. Tonya sews or knits. Alexander Alexandrovich or I read aloud. As spring approached, Yuri wrote, "I believe Tonya's pregnant." I told her. She doesn't believe me, but I feel sure of it. The early symptoms are unmistakable. I don't have to wait for the later, more certain signs to know. This year of work has brought us even closer together. Later he wrote, "I have a slight chill, a cough, probably a temperature, short of breath all day, constriction of the larynx, a lump in my throat. It's a bad business. Must be my heart. First warnings of heredity on my mother's side. She had a bad heart all her life. Can it really be that? So soon? If it is, I can't count on a long life. As soon as I feel better, I must go to the town library and read up the ethnography of the region. They say the library has had several important donations and is exceptionally good. I feel like writing, but I'll have to hurry. It'll be spring before we know where we are. Then there'll be no time for reading or writing. What is it that prevents me from being useful as a doctor or a writer? I think it's not so much our privations or our wanderings or our constantly changing and unsettled lives as the power in our day of rhetoric, of the cliché, all this dawn of the future, building a new world, torchbearers of mankind. The first time you hear it, you think, what wealth of imagination, but in fact the reason it's so pompous is there's no imagination at the back of it, because the thought is second-rate. And still later, nearly time for the spring sowing, no time to write, not even to keep a diary. It was good while it lasted. I'll put it aside until next winter. At this point, Yuri's diary breaks off. He never took it up again. Yuri looked through the books he'd taken to the reading room of the Yuriatin Public Library. He was sitting at the end of the room furthest from the door. In front of him were several historical books and 1 or 2 reference books on the ethnography of the region. He was wholly concentrated on his work and not looking about him. The crowd of readers did not distract him. He'd had a good look at his neighbours. Those on his left hand and right were fixed in his mind. He knew they were there without raising his eyes. But now he noticed a change in the room. At its further end there was a new reader. Yuri immediately recognized her. It was Lara. Yuri's first impulse was to go across and speak to her, but a shyness and lack of simplicity entirely alien to his nature had in the past crept into his relationship with her and now held him back. He decided not to disturb her and not to interrupt his work. To avoid the temptation of looking at her, he turned his chair sideways so that its back was almost against his table. He worked for an hour or so with an even greater concentration than before her arrival. He went through the whole pile of books in front of him, setting aside those he needed most, and even had time to read a couple of relevant articles he found in one of them. Then, deciding that he'd done enough for the day, he gathered up all his books and took them back to the desk. With an easy conscience, and without any ulterior motive, he reflected that after his hard morning's work he deserved to take time off to see an old friend, and that he could legitimately allow himself the pleasure of meeting her. But when he looked round the room, Lara was no longer there. The book she had just returned was still lying on the counter where he'd put his own. On her order slips, which stuck out between the pages of the book, was written her address. Yuri took it down, surprised by its oddity. Merchant Street, opposite the House of Caryatids. Into the sky, hiding the way into the yard. Through this black curtain, several hens, chased by a cock, fled clucking from under Yuri's feet. When the dust settled, he saw Lara by the well. She had filled 2 buckets and hung them on a yoke across her left shoulder. She started for the house, but was stopped by another gust which tore the kerchief from her head and carried it off to the far end of the fence. Yuri ran after it, picked it up, and brought it back to her. She looked amazed, but remained natural as always in her manner, and made no dramatic gesture of surprise. All she said was, "Zhivago." "Larissa Fyodorovna." "What on earth are you doing here?" "Put your buckets down. I'll carry them for you. I never stop halfway. I never leave what I do unfinished. If it's me you've come to see, come along." "Who else should I come to see?" "How should I know? You've been a year in the district, and you never found a moment to come till now." "How do you know?" "The world is full of rumours. Besides, I saw you in the reading room." "Why didn't you speak to me?" "Don't tell me you didn't see me." Swaying a little under the weight of the lightly swinging buckets, she walked in front of him through the low vaulted entrance. Here she bent down, put the pails down on the earth floor, took the yoke off her shoulders, straightened up, and dried her hands with a small handkerchief. "Come, I'll take you in," she said. As he followed her into the house, he was struck by the view from the window facing the door. It looked out on the yard and over the low roofs of the house beyond it to the common by the river. Reminded unaccountably of the day of his arrival from Moscow, he began at once describing it to Lara, and from this he went on to describe the details of the journey from Moscow to Yuriatin. He told her, too, of his meeting with Strelnikov. This part of the story made a deep impression on her. "You saw him? How extraordinary! It's as if you were predestined to meet. He seems to have made a good rather than a bad impression on you." "Yes, on the whole. He ought to have repelled me. We'd actually passed through the country where he'd brought death and destruction. It's a good thing when a man is different from your image of him. It shows he isn't a type. If he were, it would be the end of him as a man. But if you can't place him in a category, it means that at least a part of him is what a human being ought to be. He is free from himself. He has a grain of immortality." "They say he's not a party member," said Lara. "Yes, I think that's true. I've often wondered since what it is that makes him attractive. I think it's because he's a doomed man. He'll come to a bad end, and he will atone for the evil he's done. His alliance with the Bolsheviks is accidental. They put up with him as long as he happens to be going their way and they can use him. The moment they don't need him, they'll throw him out and trample on him quite mercilessly, as they have done with other military experts." "You think so?" "I feel sure of it." "But is there no escape for him? Couldn't he run away?" "Where could he run to, Larissa Fyodorovna? You could do that in the old days under the Tsars, but just you try nowadays." "You've made me feel sorry for him. You've changed, you know. You used to speak more optimistically about the revolution. You were less harsh about it." "There are limits to everything, Larissa Fyodorovna. In all this time, something definite should have been achieved. But it turns out that those who inspired the revolution aren't at home in anything except change and turmoil. That's their native element. They aren't happy with anything that's less than on a world scale. For them, transitional periods, worlds in the making, are an end in themselves. They aren't trained for anything else. They don't know about anything except that. And you know why there's this incessant whirl of never-ending preparations? It's because they haven't any real capacities. They're ungifted. Man is born to live, not to prepare for life. Life itself The gift of life is such a breathtakingly serious thing. Why substitute this childish harlequinade of adolescent fantasies, these schoolboy escapades? There was a short silence. Then Lara said, "As you've been so frank with me, I'll be frank with you. The Strelnikov you met is my husband, Pasha Antipov. Pasha, whom I went to look for at the front, and in whose death I so rightly refused to believe. Strelnikov is his pseudonym. He has to live under an assumed name, like all active revolutionaries. I've heard him accused of things that make my blood run cold. He's in command of one of our most advanced positions, and he's fighting and beating poor old Galyulin, his childhood friend and his comrade in arms in the German war. I suppose you think he can't be bothered with us. He doesn't love us. He's forgotten us. Well, you're wrong. I know him too well. I know just what he wants. And it's just because he loves us he can't bear to come back to us empty-handed. He wants to come back as a conqueror, full of glory, to lay his laurels at our feet, to immortalize, to dazzle us, just like a child." Some months after this conversation with Lara, Yuri was riding home from Yuriatin. He had made this journey countless times, but instead of returning home the same afternoon, he spent the night at Lara's, and later told his family that he had been kept on business, and had stayed at the inn. Yuri was deceiving Tonya, and what he concealed from her was becoming increasingly grave and illicit. He worshipped his wife. Her peace of mind meant more to him than anything in the world. He was ready to defend her honor and was more sensitive to anything touching it than her father or herself. And yet now he was offending against it himself. And now he was crushed by the weight of his guilty conscience. He felt like a criminal. His family's ignorance of the truth, their unchanged affection, were a mortal torment to him. But at this moment things had changed. He had decided to cut the knot, and he was going home with a solution. He would confess everything to Tonya, beg her to forgive him, and never see Lara again. It was true that everything was not quite smooth. He felt that now he had not made it clear enough to Lara that he was breaking with her for good, forever. He had announced to her that morning that he intended to confess everything, and that they must stop seeing one another. But now he had the feeling that he'd softened it all down and not made it sufficiently definite. She had kept saying softly, "Do as you think best. Don't worry about me. I'll get over it." She was saying it sincerely, without any false generosity, and as she did not know that she was crying, she did not wipe away the tears. As the sun went down, the forest was filled with cold and darkness. It smelled of damp leaves. Swarms of gnats hung in the air, as still as floats, humming sadly on a constant high-pitched note. Yuri dropped his reins, leaned forward in his saddle, flung his arms round the horse's neck, and buried his face in its mane. Taking this display of affection for an appeal to its strength, the horse broke into a gallop. As it bounded, its light hooves only now and then touching the ground, it seemed to Yuri that he heard shouts, but he thought he was imagining it. A shot, fired at close range, deafened him. He sat up, snatched at the reins, and pulled. Checked in full flight, the horse sidestepped, backed, and went down on its haunches, ready to rear. 3 horsemen blocked his way. A boy in a cap and a tunic with 2 cartridge belts, a cavalryman in an officer's greatcoat and fur cap, and a fat man, oddly clothed in quilted trousers and a wide-brimmed clerical hat, pulled low over his forehead. "Don't move, comrade doctor," said the cavalryman. "If you obey orders, you'll be perfectly safe. If you don't, no offence meant, we'll shoot you. The surgeon attached to our unit's been killed, and we are conscripting you as a medical worker. Get down and hand the reins over to this young man, and let me remind you, if you try to escape, we shan't stand on ceremony." The partisans were the backbone of the Revolutionary Army in the Civil War, a force which arose out of the conjunction of 2 factors. On the one hand, the political organization which assumed the leadership of the revolution, and on the other, the rank and file of the army who refused to obey the old authorities once the German war was lost. Out of these two things, the partisan army came into being. Most of them are middle peasants, but you could find all sorts of people, poor peasants, unfrocked monks, sons of kulaks up in arms against their fathers. There are anarchist idealists, people on the run without papers, and high school boys expelled for affairs with women. One of the units of this great people's army was called the Forest Brotherhood. Yuri remained a prisoner of the Forest Brotherhood for almost 2 years. The limits of his freedom were ill-defined. The place of his captivity was not surrounded by walls. No guard was kept over him, and no one watched his movements. The partisan force was constantly on the move. It did not keep itself apart from the local populations through whose lands and settlements it passed. It mixed and indeed dissolved in them. But although he was not fettered, chained, or watched, Yuri had to submit to his unfreedom, imaginary though it appeared. Each of his 3 attempts at escaping from the partisans had ended in capture. He did not suffer any penalties, but he knew he was playing with fire. He was favoured by the partisan chief Liberius, who liked his company and made him sleep in his tent. Yuri found this enforced companionship irksome. During this period, the partisans were constantly moving to the east. At times this movement represented an advance. At other moments, when the whites struck from the rear and threatened to encircle the reds, the same eastward marches turned into flight. For a long time Yuri could not make any sense of it. But what with typhus in winter and dysentery in summer, as well as an increased number of wounded when the fighting was renewed, Yuri was up to his eyes in work. In the winter of the 2nd year of Yuri's captivity, the partisans took up quarters in Fox's Thicket, a steep wooded hill with a swift stream foaming round 3 sides of it and biting into the shores. Yuri shared a dugout with Liberius, who had kept him awake by chattering for 2 nights. "You missed the study circle again last night," said the partisan chief. "You have an atrophied social sense, just like an illiterate peasant woman or an inveterate bourgeois, and yet you are a doctor. You're well read. How do you explain it?" "God, how I hate this buffoonery," Yuri sighed to himself, and then answered aloud in a tired voice, "I don't. I expect I'm too stupid. It can't be helped. You should be sorry for me. If, instead of using that ironic tone, you took the trouble to find out what we do in our classes, you wouldn't be so supercilious." "Heavens, Liberius Avasievich, I'm not being supercilious. I have the utmost respect for your educational work. I've read the discussion notes you circulate. I know your ideas on the moral improvement of the soldier. They're excellent. All you say about what the soldier's attitude should be towards his comrades, to the weak, the helpless, to women, and about honour and chastity, is almost the teaching of the Doukhobors. All that kind of Tolstoyism I know by heart. My own adolescence was full of these aspirations towards a better life. How could I laugh at such things? But firstly, the idea of social betterment, as it's understood since the October Revolution, doesn't fill me with enthusiasm. Secondly, it's so far from being put into practice, and the mere talk about it has cost such a sea of blood, that I'm not at all sure if the end justifies the means. And lastly, and above all, when I hear people talking of reshaping life, I fall into despair. Reshaping life? People who can say that have never understood a thing about life. They've never felt its breath, its heart, however much they've seen or done. They look on it as a lump of raw material which needs to be processed by them, to be ennobled by their touch. But life is never a material, a substance to be moulded. Life is the principle of self-renewal. It is constantly renewing and remaking and changing and transfiguring itself. It is infinitely beyond your or my inept theories about it. Liberius smiled. "You're angry," he said. "That means you must be wrong." "Oh, I'll admit that you are Russia's liberators," Yuri went on, her shining light, that without you she'd be lost, sunk in misery and ignorance, "but I still don't give a damn for any of you. I don't like you, and you can all go to the devil." He got up and went out of the tent. It was a clear night with a full moon. He knew where the sentries were posted and avoided them successfully. The footpath brought him to the foot of a rowan tree. It was covered half in snow, half in frozen leaves and berries, and it held out 2 white branches welcomingly. He remembered Lara's strong white arms, and seized the branches and pulled them to him. As if in answer, the tree shook snow all over him. He muttered senselessly, "I'll find you, my beauty, my love, my rowan tree, my own flesh and blood." Merchant Street rambled crookedly downhill, overlooked by the houses and churches of the upper part of Yuriatin. The huge square stones of the lower part of the facade of the House of Caryatides were black with freshly posted sheets of government newspapers and proclamations. Small groups of people stood in front of it, reading in silence. The Whites had long since gone, surrendering the town to the Reds. The terrors of the war, shelling and bloodshed, had ceased. One of the proclamations posted on the wall, and still readable by the light of the longer day, announced that Labour books are obtainable by those qualified at the cost of 50 rubles each at the Food Office, Yuriatin, Soviet No. 5, October Street, formerly Governor-General Street, room 137. Anyone without a Labour book, or filling in his or her Labour book incorrectly, or making false statements, will be prosecuted with the utmost rigour under the wartime regulations. Detailed instructions for the correct use of Labour books are printed in INIK number 86-1013 for the current year, and are posted up at the Yuriatin Food Office, room 137. Yuri meant to read the notices posted up on the house of the Caryatids, but his eyes kept wandering to the windows of the house across the street. He crossed the road, went in and climbed the staircase, which was so familiar and so dear to him. How often at the partisans' camp had he remembered every turn of it and every scroll of the open-work pattern of the cast-iron steps. Yuri felt certain that Lara would not be there, even if she was still alive, and even if she still lived in Yuriatin. He was prepared for the most bitter disappointments, and it was only to relieve his conscience that he decided to look for the key that Lara used to leave in the hollow between the bricks. He had not the slightest hope of finding anything. The hollow was closed by a brick. He removed it and felt inside. Miraculously, it had a key and a note in it. Yuri took the note to the window on the landing. Still more miraculously, more unbelievably, the note was addressed to him. He read it quickly. "Lord, what happiness! They say you're alive and have come back. Someone saw you near the town and rushed over to tell me. I take it you'll go straight to Varikino, so I'm going there myself with Katya. But just in case, I'm leaving the key in the usual place. Wait for me. Don't go. The flat is rather empty. I've had to sell some furniture. I've left a little food, boiled potatoes mostly. Put the lid back on the saucepan with a weight on it to keep the rats out. I'm mad with joy. Do you know that your people are in Moscow? Tonya has had a little girl." After that, several lines were crossed out. Then, "I've crossed it out because it's silly to write about it. We'll talk to our heart's content when we meet." That evening, when the fire had burned down, Yuri closed the flue and had something to eat. After that he felt so sleepy that he lay down on the sofa without undressing, and at once fell fast asleep. The loud, insolent noise of the rats behind the walls didn't reach him. He had 2 bad dreams, one after the other. He woke up sweating and in tears. "I've got a temperature. I'm ill," he thought. "This isn't typhus. This is some sort of exhaustion which is taking the form of a dangerous illness. An illness with a crisis. It'll be like any serious infectious disease, and it only remains to be seen which is going to win, life or death. But I'm too sleepy to think." He dropped off to sleep again. When he woke again, the snowy windows had filled with the light of dawn or sunset, glowing like red wine through a crystal glass. Suddenly he realized that he was now neither dreaming nor delirious, but that in sober truth he was lying, washed and in a clean shirt, not on the sofa, but in a freshly made bed, and that the person who was crying with him, sitting beside him, leaning over him, her hair mingling with his and her tears falling with his own, was Lara. All his life, Yuri had been active, doing things about the house, looking after patients, thinking, studying, writing. How good it was to stop doing, struggling, thinking, to leave it all for a time to nature, to become her thing, her concern, the work of her merciful, wonderful, beauty-lavishing hands. They loved each other greatly. Most people experience love without noticing that there's anything remarkable about it. To them, and this made them unusual, the moments when passion visited their doomed human existence like a breath of timelessness were moments of revelation, of even greater understanding of life and of themselves. "Of course you must go back to your family, darling," Lara agreed when Yuri was feeling a little stronger. "I don't want to keep you a day more than is necessary. But you don't know how much things have changed while you've been away. As soon as we became part of Soviet Russia, we were swallowed up in her disintegration. Our supplies were all sent to Moscow. For them it's a drop in the ocean. All these truckloads simply vanish down a bottomless pit. And in the meantime, nothing's left for us. There are no mails, there's no passenger service, all the trains are used for grain. How could you travel, weak as you are? You're nothing but skin and bone. Do you really imagine you could go on foot? You'd never get there. When you're stronger, it will be quite different. If you'll take my advice, you'll get a job for the time being. Work at your profession, they'd like that. You might get something in the regional health service. You'll have to do something. As it is, it doesn't look too good. Your father was a Siberian millionaire who committed suicide. Your wife is the daughter of a local landowner, and you are a fugitive from the partisans, which amounts to desertion. It would be dangerous for you to be unemployed. I'm not in a much better position myself. I'll get a job, too. I'll go back to school teaching. I'm living on a volcano as it is. How do you mean? What about Strelnikov, your husband? Now that the Red Army is victorious, those non-party soldiers who got too near to the top and knew too much are done for. Lucky if they're only thrown out and not wiped out. Pasha is particularly vulnerable. He's in very great danger. You know he was out in the east. I've heard that he's run away and is in hiding. They're hunting for him. But don't let's talk about it. You're still very much in love with him? Well, darling, I married him. He's my husband. He has a wonderful, upright, shining personality. I'm very much at fault that our marriage went wrong. It isn't that I ever did him any harm. It wouldn't be true to say that, but he is so outstanding, so big, he has such immense integrity. And I'm no good at all. I'm nothing in comparison with him. That's where my fault lies. But please, don't let's talk about it now. I'll tell you more some other time. I promise you I will. Summer came and went, almost unnoticed. Yuri recovered, and while planning to go to Moscow, took up not one but 2 temporary jobs. Every morning he got up at cockcrow, left the house, and walked down Merchant Street to the hospital, and went through the back door to the outpatients department of the army section. This was his main job. Then 3 or 4 times during his 10-day week, Yuri attended the board meetings of the Uryatin Health Service in Miasky Street. The nearer he was drawn to Lara and her daughter, the less Yuri ventured to take domesticity for granted, and the stricter was the control imposed on his thoughts by his duty to his family and the pain of his broken faith. The division in him was a sorrow and a torment, and he became accustomed to it only as one who gets used to an unhealed and frequently opened wound. After 2 or 3 months of living like this, one day in October a neighbour came to the door with a letter for Yuri. "I don't know how many hands it's been through," she said. "It's from Moscow, and it's been 5 months on the way." The long letter, Written on many sheets of paper, creased and soiled in the tattered envelope which had been opened at the post office, was from Tonia. When Yuri began reading it, he was still conscious of being in Yuriatin, in Lara's house, but gradually, as he read on, he lost all awareness of it.
"Yuri," Tonia wrote, "do you know that we have a daughter? We've christened her Masha, in memory of your mother. Now, about something else. Several prominent people, professors who belong to the Cadet Party and right-wing socialists, including your Uncle Kolya, my father, and the rest of us, are being deported from Russia. This is a misfortune, especially in your absence, but we must accept it, and thank God that our exile takes so mild a form at this terrible time, when things could have been so much worse for us. If you were here, you could come with us. But where are you? I'm sending this letter to Antipova's address. She'll give it to you if she finds you. I've not given up believing that you're alive and that you'll be found. My heart tells me that this is so, and I trust it. Perhaps by then, by the time you reappear, conditions in Russia will be milder, and you'll manage to get a separate visa for yourself, and we shall all be once more together in the same place. Nothing is definitely settled yet, but we're probably going to Paris. I'll be in those distant lands where you were taken as a child, and where Father and my uncle were brought up. Father sends you his greetings. Sasha has grown a lot. He's not particularly good-looking, but he's a big, strong boy, and whenever we speak of you, he cries bitterly and won't be comforted. I can't go on. I can't stop crying. Oh, Yuri, Yuri, my dear, my darling, my husband, what is happening to us? Let me make the sign of the cross over you and bless you for all the years ahead, for the endless parting, the trials, the uncertainties, for all your long, long and dark way. I'm not blaming you for anything. I'm not reproaching you. Make your life as you wish. Only so that you're all right. Yuri finished reading and raised his eyes. They were absent, tearless, dry with grief, emptied by suffering. He neither saw nor was aware of anything round him.
One day in November, Yuri said to Lara, "You know, it looks as if I'd be forced to resign from my jobs. It's always the same. It happens again and again. At first, everything's splendid. Come along. We welcome good, honest work. We welcome ideas, especially new ideas. What could please us better? Do your work, your research. Struggle. Carry on. Then you find in practice what they mean by ideas is nothing but words, claptrap, in praise of the revolution and the regime. I'm sick and tired of it, and it's not the kind of thing I'm good at." "You're right," said Lara. "The air is getting thick. Our time of safety is over. Though what we can do, I can't think. We certainly can't escape. There's nowhere to go. But we could get out of the limelight. We might go to Varikino, for instance. I keep thinking of the house there. It's very lonely and neglected, but we wouldn't attract so much attention there. Our days are really numbered. So at least let's take advantage of them in our own way. Let's use them up, saying goodbye to life. Let's be alone together for the last time." They left town on the morning of a grey winter day. The sleigh pitched and tossed on the uneven road like a ship in a storm. Lara and Katya were bundled up in their fur coats so that they could hardly move. Swinging round corners and bumping over ruts, they rolled from side to side and down in the hay like sacks, shrieking with laughter. Sometimes Yuri drove the sleigh into the snowy banks on purpose for a joke, and tipped them all out harmlessly into the snow. They swept into Varikino at dusk. After a meal and a quick inspection of the empty house, Yuri lit the lamp on the table. Lara and Katya went to bed early. The stillness which surrounded Yuri breathed with happiness and life. The lamplight fell softly on the table. Outside, the frosty winter night was pale blue. To see it better, Yuri stepped into the cold, dark room next door and looked out of the window. The light of the full moon bound the snowy plain like white of egg, or stiffened whitewash. The splendour of the frosty night was inexpressible.
Yuri's heart was at peace. He came back into the warm, well-lit room. He looked at the two sleeping heads on their snow-white pillows. The purity of their features and of the night, the snow, the stars, the moon, surged through his heart in a single wave of meaning, and roused in him a joyful sense of the triumphant purity of being. "Lord, Lord," he whispered, "and all this is for me? Why hast thou given me so much?" They had been at Varikino 2 weeks. One afternoon Yuri was in the barn when the mare turned its head in the direction of the house and whinnied, at first softly, timidly, then louder, with assurance. The whinny was answered from outside the barn. Yuri went to the door and saw that in front of the house stood a roomy peasant sleigh with a sleek black colt harnessed to it. He hurried over to the house and went inside. As he entered the room, there was a sudden silence. With disbelief, Yuri found himself facing Komarovsky, who stared back at him, undisturbed. "Why are you here?" said Yuri at last. Lara rushed over to him distractedly. "Yuri, darling," she cried, "we're in great danger. Komarovsky's come to help us. I realize how you must feel, but please do put your feelings aside." Komarovsky smiled. "Let us assume we're just old acquaintances," he said. "I was a great friend of your father's, as you probably know. He died in my arms." "What is it you want?" said Yuri angrily. "Don't flare up so fast, young man. You take after your father. He used to lose his temper just like that." Komarovsky paused, then continued, "Let me explain. In 2 days here, I've learned more about you than you know or suspect about yourselves. Without knowing it, you are walking on the edge of a precipice. Unless you do something about it, the days of your freedom, and perhaps even of your lives, are numbered. There exists a certain communist style, Yuri Andreevich. Few people measure up to it, but no one flouts that way of life and thought as openly as you do. Why you have to flirt with danger, I can't imagine. You're a mockery of that whole world, an insult to it. If at least your past were your own secret. But there are people from Moscow who know you inside out. However, you're a man, Yuri Andreevich. You're your own master, and you have a perfect right to play the fool and risk your life if you feel like it. But Larissa Fyodorovna is not a free agent. She is a mother. She has a child's life in her hands, and she can't go about with her head in the clouds. I'm trying to get her to take the situation seriously. Now listen to me. Big changes are being planned at the top. I have it from a most reliable source, and you can take it that it's true. What they have in mind is a switch over to a more democratic course, a concession to legality, and this will come about quite soon. But just because of it, the members of punitive agencies, whose jobs are due to be abolished, are in a great hurry to square their local accounts. So before the end, there will be a period of greater savagery than we've yet seen. You are marked down for destruction, Yuri Andreevich. Your name is on the list. I'm telling you this in all seriousness. I've seen it myself. You must think of saving yourself before it's too late." Komarovsky paused and looked at them for a moment, then sat down heavily. "But all this is by way of introduction," he continued. "I'm coming to the point. Those political forces which are still faithful to the Provisional Government and the disbanded Constituent Assembly are concentrating in the maritime province on the Pacific coast. They intend to form a Far Eastern Republic, and the Soviet government winks at it, because at the moment it would suit it to have a buffer between Red Siberia and the outside world. The Republic is to have a coalition government. More than half the seats, at the insistence of Moscow, will go to communists. When it suits them, they will stage a coup d'etat and bring the Republic to heel. The plan is quite transparent, but it gives us a certain breathing space. We must make the best of it. An envoy came to see me on behalf of the Shadow Cabinet to offer me the post of Minister of Justice in the future government. This was done secretly, but with unofficial Soviet approval. I accepted, and I'm on my way there now. I can take you and Larissa Fyodorovna and the child with me. From there you can easily get a boat and join your family overseas. You know, of course, that they've been expelled from the country. I've promised Larissa Fyodorovna to save Strelnikov.
As a member of an independent government recognized by Moscow, I can look for him in eastern Siberia and help him to cross over into our autonomous region. If he does not succeed in escaping, I'll suggest that he should be exchanged for someone who is in Allied custody and is of interest to the Moscow government. Blushing a little, Lara turned to Yuri. You see, darling, how important all this is for you and for Pasha. You're too trusting, my dear, said Yuri. You can't take a half-formed plan for an accomplished fact. I don't say Viktor Ippolitovich is deliberately misleading us, but so far he's only told us about castles in the air. For my part, he turned to Komarovsky, thank you for the interest you take in my affairs, but you surely don't imagine that I'm going to let you run them. As for Strelnikov, Lara will have to think it over. All it comes down to, said Lara, is whether we go with him or not. You know perfectly well I couldn't go without you. There's no time to lose, said Komarovsky. In the sidings at Yuriatin, an official train of the Far Eastern government is standing under steam. It arrived yesterday from Moscow and is leaving tomorrow for the East. It belongs to our Ministry of Communication. Half the carriages are wagon-lit. I have to go by this train. Several seats have been put at my disposal for my assistants. There won't ever be another chance like this again, only we must really hurry. There's not a moment to lose. Let us leave at once. My sleigh is outside. We can spend the night on the train. You only need to pack the most essential things for the journey, whatever comes to hand first. There's no time to fuss with packing when it's a question of a child's life. I don't understand you, Viktor Ippolitovich, said Yuri. You talk as if I'd agreed to come. For myself, I should like to do everything possible to stay here for some time. I'm longing to get back to work. I don't mean farming. That's what we were doing here before. I've something else in mind. I believe that things are gradually settling down. I don't want to believe that the danger is as great as you say. But if Lara wishes, I agree that she should take Katya and go with you now. She has not only her own future to consider, there is Katya, and— What are you talking about, Yuri? Lara interrupted angrily. What's all this nonsense? If Lara wishes indeed, as if you did perfectly well know that I shan't go without you. So you are quite adamant, said Komarovsky. In that case, with Larisa Fyodorovna's permission, I should like to have a couple of words with you, if possible alone. Komarovsky closed the kitchen door behind him and turned to face Yuri. Strelnikov has been captured, condemned to death and shot, he said quietly. Are you sure? It's what I've been told, and I'm convinced it's true. Don't tell Lara. She'll go out of her mind. Of course I won't. That's why I asked to speak to you alone. Now that this has happened, she and Katya are in imminent danger. You must help to save them. Are you quite sure you won't go with us? Quite sure. I've told you already. But she won't go without you. Komarovsky walked to the table and sat down heavily. We'll have to make her think that you're coming later, he said suddenly. For instance, you might pretend that you're going to get your sleigh ready and urge us to start at once without waiting for you, not to waste any time. You'll say you'll catch up with us as soon as you're ready. You'll simply have to make her believe that. Very well then, said Yuri. For her sake, I'll go out now and tell her that I'll get my things ready, see to the locking up and the securing of the house, and catch up with you later. But in fact, I shall stay behind. Yuri stood in the porch, his coat over one shoulder. What have I done, he thought. What have I done? I've given her up, renounced her, given her away. She has no idea of the trick I've played on her. She's thinking it's wonderful that things have gone so well. They couldn't be better. Her absurd, obstinate Yuri has relented at last, thank heavens. We're going to a nice, safe place, where people are more sensible than we are, where you can be sure of law and order. At this moment he's in the stables, hurrying, excited, fumbling with the harness, and he'll rush after us full tilt and catch up with us before we get into the forest. That's what she must be thinking. He came in, locked the door behind him, and took off his coat. When he came into the bedroom which Lara had tidied up so well and so carefully that morning, and which our hurried packing had again turned inside out, when he saw the untidy bed and the things thrown about in disorder on the chairs and the floor, he knelt down like a child, leaned his breast against the hard edge of the bedstead, buried his head in the bedclothes, and wept freely and bitterly as children do. Soon he got up,
hastily dried his face, looked round him with tired, absent-minded surprise, got out a bottle of vodka, drew the cork, poured half a glassful, added water, and with a relish almost equal in strength to the hopelessness of the tears he had shed, drank long, greedy gulps. All that is left to tell is the brief story of the last 8 or 10 years of Zhivago's life, years in which he went more and more to seed, gradually losing his knowledge and skill as a doctor and writer, emerging from his state of depression and resuming his work only to fall back, after a short flare-up of activity, into long periods of indifference to himself and to everything in the world. During these years, the heart disease, which he had himself diagnosed earlier but without any real idea of its gravity, developed to an advanced stage. He came to Moscow in the spring of 1922. For some months he did nothing at all but simply exist. Then at the end of August he managed to obtain a minor post at the Soldatenko hospital. On the morning of the first day of work he took the tram from Gazetny Street, where he had lodgings. It was a hot morning, and the car was crowded and airless. A storm was gathering. Yuri sat on a single seat on the left, pressed against the window. He could see the left side of Nikita Street, the side of the conservatoire. With the vague attention of a man thinking of something else, he watched the people walking and driving past on that side, missing no one. A lady in a light straw hat, with linen daisies and cornflowers, and a lilac dress, was walking along the pavement. Exhausted by the heat, she kept dabbing her lips and eyebrows with a small lace handkerchief. It was Lara. Her course lay parallel with that of the tram. Yuri lost sight of her as the tram started after a stoppage for repairs, and passed her. She came into his field of vision again when it broke down once more, and she overtook it. There was a flash of lightning and a roll of thunder. The first heavy drops of rain fell on the roadway. Yuri felt sick and faint. Overcoming his weakness, he got up and jerked the window straps up and down, trying to open the window, but he couldn't move it. People shouted to him that the window was blocked. It was nailed in position. But Yuri, fighting off his faintness and seized by a sort of panic, neither understood the cries nor referred them to himself. He went on trying to open the window, and again gave 3 sharp tugs at the strap. Suddenly he felt a new and mortal pain. He understood that something had broken in him. He'd done something irreparable, and that this was the end. At this moment the tram started, but it had only gone a short way down Presnia Street when it stopped again. By an inhuman effort of the will, Yuri pushed through the solid crowd down the gangway, swaying and stumbling, and came out on the rear platform. People blocked his way, snapped at him. The fresh air seemed to revive him, and he thought that perhaps not everything was lost. Perhaps he was better. He began to squeeze his way through the crush on the rear platform, provoking more snarls, curses, and kicks. He paid no attention to them, tore himself free of the crowd, climbed down from the stationary tram into the roadway, took a step, another, a third, fell down on the cobbles, and did not get up again. Lara walked on, overtaking the tram for the 6th time, and quite unaware that she had overtaken Zhivago and survived him.